Chapter 31 of The Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Floyd Wilde. The Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 31 Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp. There once lived a poor tailor, who had a son called Aladdin, a careless, idle boy who would do nothing but play all day long in the streets with little idle boys like himself. This so grieved the father that he died. Yet, in spite of his mother's tears and prayers, Aladdin did not mend his ways. One day, when he was playing in the streets as usual, a stranger asked him his age, and if he were not the son of Mustafa the tailor. "I am, sir," replied Aladdin, "but he died a long while ago." On this the stranger, who was a famous African magician, fell on his neck and kissed him, saying, "I am your uncle, and knew you from your likeness to my brother. Go to your mother and tell her I am coming." Aladdin ran home and told his mother of his newly found uncle. "Indeed, child," she said, "your father had a brother, but I always thought he was dead." However, she prepared supper, and bade Aladdin seek his uncle, who came laden with wine and fruit. He presently fell down and kissed the place where Mustafa used to sit, bidding Aladdin's mother not to be surprised at not having seen him before, as he had been 40 years out of the country. He then turned to Aladdin and asked him his trade, at which the boy hung his head, while his mother burst into tears. On learning that Aladdin was idle and would learn no trade, he offered to take a shop for him and stock it with merchandise. Next day he bought Aladdin a fine suit of clothes and took him all over the city, showing him the sights, and brought him home at nightfall to his mother, who was overjoyed to see her son so fine. Next day the magician led Aladdin into some beautiful gardens a long way outside the city gates. They sat down by a fountain, and the magician pulled a cake from his girdle, which he divided between them. They then journeyed onwards till they almost reached the mountains. Aladdin was so tired that he begged to go back, but the magician beguiled him with pleasant stories, and led him on in spite of himself. At last they came to two mountains divided by a narrow valley. "We will go no farther," said the false uncle. "I will show you something wonderful. Only do you gather up sticks while I kindle a fire." When it was lit, the magician threw on it a powder he had about him, at the same time saying some magical words. The earth trembled a little, and opened in front of them, disclosing a square flat stone with a brass ring in the middle to raise it by. Aladdin tried to run away, but the magician caught him and gave him a blow that knocked him down. "What have I done, uncle?" he said piteously, whereupon the magician said more kindly, "Fear nothing, but obey me. Beneath the stone lies a treasure which is to be yours, and no one else may touch it, so you must do exactly as I tell you." At the word treasure, Aladdin forgot his fears, and grasped the ring as he was told, saying the names of his father and grandfather. The stone came up quite easily, and some steps appeared. "Go down," said the magician. "At the foot of those steps you will find an open door leading into 3 large halls. Tuck up your gown and go through them without touching anything, or you will die instantly. These halls lead into a garden of fine fruit trees. Walk on till you come to a niche in a terrace where stands a lighted lamp. Pour out the oil it contains and bring it to me." He drew a ring from his finger and gave it to Aladdin, bidding him prosper. Aladdin found everything as the magician had said, gathered some fruit off the trees, and, having got the lamp, arrived at the mouth of the cave. The magician cried out in a great hurry, "Make haste and give me the lamp." This Aladdin refused to do until he was out of the cave. The magician flew into a terrible passion, and throwing some more powder on the fire, he said something, and the stone rolled back into its place. The magician left Persia forever, which plainly showed that he was no uncle of Aladdin's, but a cunning magician who had read in his magic books of a wonderful lamp, which would make him the most powerful man in the world. Though he alone knew where to find it, he could only receive it from the hand of another. He had picked out the foolish Aladdin for this purpose, intending to get the lamp and kill him afterwards. For 2 days Aladdin remained in the dark, crying and lamenting. At last he clasped his hands in prayer, and in so doing rubbed the ring, which the magician had forgotten to take from him. Immediately an enormous and frightful genie rose out of the earth, saying, "What wouldst thou with me? I am the slave of the ring, and will obey thee in all things." Aladdin fearlessly replied, "Deliver me from this place," whereupon the earth opened and he found himself outside. As soon as his eyes could bear the light he went home, but fainted on the threshold. When he came to himself he told his mother what had passed, and showed her the lamp and the fruits he had gathered in the garden, which were in reality precious stones. He then asked for some food. "Alas, child," she said, "I have nothing in the house, but I have spun a little cotton, and will go and sell it." Aladdin bade her keep her cotton, for he would sell the lamp instead. As it was very dirty she began to rub it, that it might fetch a higher price. Instantly a hideous genie appeared, and asked what she would have. She fainted away, but Aladdin, snatching the lamp, said boldly, "Fetch me something to eat." The genie returned with a silver bowl, 12 silver plates containing rich meats, 2 silver cups, and 2 bottles of wine. Aladdin's mother, when she came to herself, said, "Whence comes this splendid feast?" "Ask not, but eat," replied Aladdin. So they sat at breakfast till it was dinner time, and Aladdin told his mother about the lamp. She begged him to sell it and have nothing to do with devils. "No," said Aladdin, "since chance has made us aware of its virtues, we will use it and the ring likewise, which I shall always wear on my finger." When they had eaten all the genie had brought, Aladdin sold one of the silver plates, and so on till none were left. He then had recourse to the genie, who gave him another set of plates, and thus they lived for many years. One day Aladdin heard an order from the Sultan proclaim that everyone was to stay at home and close his shutters while the princess, his daughter, went to and from the bath. Aladdin was seized by a desire to see her face, which was very difficult, as she always went veiled. He hid himself behind the door of the bath and peeped through a chink. The princess lifted her veil as she went in, and looked so beautiful that Aladdin fell in love with her at first sight. He went home so changed that his mother was frightened. He told her that he loved the princess so deeply that he could not live without her, and meant to ask her in marriage of her father. His mother, on hearing this, burst out laughing, but Aladdin at last prevailed upon her to go before the Sultan and carry his request. She fetched a napkin and laid in it the magic fruits from the enchanted garden, which sparkled and shone like the most beautiful jewels. She took these with her to please the Sultan, and set out, trusting in the lamp. The Grand Vizier and the Lords of Council had just gone in as she entered the hall and placed herself in front of the Sultan. He, however, took no notice of her. She went every day for a week, and stood in the same place. When the council broke up on the 6th day, the Sultan said to his Vizier, "I see a certain woman in the audience chamber every day, carrying something in a napkin. Call her next time, that I may find out what she wants." Next day, at a sign from the Vizier, she went up to the foot of the throne and remained kneeling till the Sultan said to her, "Rise, good woman, and tell me what you want." She hesitated, so the Sultan sent away all but the Vizier, and bade her speak freely, promising to forgive her beforehand for anything she might say. She then told him of her son's violent love for the princess. "I prayed him to forget her," she said, "but in vain. He threatened to do some desperate deed if I refused to go and ask your Majesty for the hand of the princess. Now I pray you to forgive not me alone, but my son Aladdin." The Sultan asked her kindly what she had in the napkin, whereupon she unfolded the jewels and presented them. He was thunderstruck, and turning to the Vizier said, "What sayest thou? Ought I not to bestow the princess on one who values her at such a price?" The Vizier, who wanted her for his own son, begged the Sultan to withhold her for 3 months, in the course of which he hoped his son would contrive to make him a richer present. The Sultan granted this, and told Aladdin's mother that, though he consented to the marriage, she must not appear before him again for 3 months. Aladdin waited patiently for nearly 3 months, but after 2 had elapsed his mother, going into the city to buy oil, found everyone rejoicing, and asked what was going on. "Do you not know," was the answer, "that the son of the Grand Vizier is to marry the Sultan's daughter tonight?" Breathless, she ran and told Aladdin, who was overwhelmed at first, but presently bethought him of the lamp. He rubbed it, and the genie appeared, saying, "What is thy will?" Aladdin replied, "The Sultan, as thou knowest, has broken his promise to me, and the vizier's son is to have the princess. My command is that tonight you bring hither the bride and bridegroom." "Master, I obey," said the genie. Aladdin then went to his chamber, where, sure enough, at midnight the genie transported the bed containing the vizier's son and the princess. "Take this new married man," he said, "and put him outside in the cold, and return at daybreak." Whereupon the genie took the vizier's son out of bed, leaving Aladdin with the princess. "Fear nothing," Aladdin said to her. "You are my wife, promised to me by your unjust father, and no harm shall come to you." The princess was too frightened to speak, and passed the most miserable night of her life, while Aladdin lay down beside her and slept soundly. At the appointed hour the genie fetched in the shivering bridegroom, laid him in his place, and transported the bed back to the palace. Presently the Sultan came to wish his daughter good morning. The unhappy vizier's son jumped up and hid himself, while the princess would not say a word, and was very sorrowful. The Sultan sent her mother to her, who said, "How comes it, child, that you will not speak to your father? What has happened?" The princess sighed deeply, and at last told her mother how, during the night, the bed had been carried into some strange house, and what had passed there. Her mother did not believe her in the least, but bade her rise and consider it an idle dream. The following night exactly the same thing happened, and next morning, on the princess's refusing to speak, the Sultan threatened to cut off her head. She then confessed all, bidding him ask the vizier's son if it were not so. The Sultan told the vizier to ask his son, who owned the truth, adding that, dearly as he loved the princess, he had rather die than go through another such fearful night, and wished to be separated from her. His wish was granted, and there was an end of feasting and rejoicing. When the 3 months were over, Aladdin sent his mother to remind the Sultan of his promise. She stood in the same place as before, and the Sultan, who had forgotten Aladdin, at once remembered him, and sent for her. On seeing her poverty the Sultan felt less inclined than ever to keep his word, and asked the vizier's advice, who counselled him to set so high a value on the princess that no man living could come up to it. The Sultan then turned to Aladdin's mother, saying, "Good woman, a sultan must remember his promises, and I will remember mine. But your son must first send me 40 basins of gold brimful of jewels, carried by 40 black slaves, led by as many white ones, splendidly dressed. Tell him that I await his answer." The mother of Aladdin bowed low, and went home, thinking all was lost. She gave Aladdin the message, adding, "He may wait long enough for your answer." "Not so long, mother, as you think," her son replied. "I would do a great deal more than that for the princess." He summoned the genie, and in a few moments the 80 slaves arrived, and filled up the small house and garden. Aladdin made them set out to the palace 2 and 2, followed by his mother. They were so richly dressed, with such splendid jewels in their girdles, that everyone crowded to see them and the basins of gold they carried on their heads. They entered the palace, and, after kneeling before the Sultan, stood in a half circle round the throne with their arms crossed, while Aladdin's mother presented them to the Sultan. He hesitated no longer, but said, "Good woman, return and tell your son that I wait for him with open arms." She lost no time in telling Aladdin, bidding him make haste, but Aladdin first called the genie. "I want a scented bath," he said, "a richly embroidered habit, a horse surpassing the Sultan's, and 20 slaves to attend me. Besides this, 6 slaves, beautifully dressed, to wait on my mother, and lastly 10,000 pieces of gold in 10 purses." No sooner said than done. Aladdin mounted his horse and passed through the streets, the slaves strewing gold as they went. Those who had played with him in his childhood knew him not, he had grown so handsome. When the Sultan saw him he came down from his throne, embraced him, and led him into a hall where a feast was spread, intending to marry him to the princess that very day. But Aladdin refused, saying, "I must build a palace fit for her," and took his leave. Once home he said to the genie, "Build me a palace of the finest marble, set with jasper, agate, and other precious stones. In the middle you shall build me a large hall with a dome, its 4 walls of massy gold and silver, each side having 6 windows, whose lattices, all except one, which is to be left unfinished, must be set with diamonds and rubies. There must be stables and horses and grooms and slaves. Go and see about it." The palace was finished by the next day, and the genie carried him there and showed him all his orders faithfully carried out, even to the laying of a velvet carpet from Aladdin's palace to the Sultan's. Aladdin's mother then dressed herself carefully and walked to the palace with her slaves, while he followed her on horseback. The Sultan sent musicians with trumpets and cymbals to meet them, so that the air resounded with music and cheers. She was taken to the princess, who saluted her and treated her with great honour. At night the princess said goodbye to her father and set out on the carpet for Aladdin's palace, with his mother at her side, and followed by the 100 slaves. She was charmed at the sight of Aladdin, who ran to receive her. "Princess," he said, "blame your beauty for my boldness, if I have displeased you." She told him that, having seen him, she willingly obeyed her father in this matter. After the wedding had taken place Aladdin led her into the hall, where a feast was spread, and she supped with him, after which they danced till midnight. Next day Aladdin invited the Sultan to see the palace. On entering the hall, with the 24 windows, with their rubies, diamonds, and emeralds, he cried, "It is a world's wonder! There is only one thing that surprises me. Was it by accident that one window was left unfinished?" "No, sir, by design," returned Aladdin. "I wished your Majesty to have the glory of finishing this palace." The Sultan was pleased, and sent for the best jewelers in the city. He showed them the unfinished window, and bade them fit it up like the others. "Sir," replied the spokesman, "we cannot find jewels enough." The Sultan had his own fetched, which they soon used, but to no purpose, for in a month's time the work was not half done. Aladdin, knowing that their task was vain, bade them undo their work and carry the jewels back, and the genie finished the window at his command. The Sultan was surprised to receive his jewels again, and visited Aladdin, who showed him the window finished. The Sultan embraced him, the envious vizier meanwhile hinting that it was the work of enchantment. Aladdin had won the hearts of the people by his gentle bearing. He was made captain of the Sultan's armies, and won several battles for him, but remained modest and courteous as before, and lived thus in peace and content for several years. But far away in Africa, the magician remembered Aladdin, and by his magic arts discovered that Aladdin, instead of perishing miserably in the cave, had escaped, and had married a princess with whom he was living in great honour and wealth. He knew that the poor tailor's son could only have accomplished this by means of the lamp, and travelled night and day till he reached the capital of China, bent on Aladdin's ruin. As he passed through the town he heard people talking everywhere about a marvellous palace. "Forgive my ignorance," he asked. "What is this palace you speak of?" "Have you not heard of Prince Aladdin's palace?" was the reply. "The greatest wonder of the world? I will direct you if you have a mind to see it." The magician thanked him who spoke, and having seen the palace, knew that it had been raised by the genie of the lamp, and became half mad with rage. He determined to get hold of the lamp, and again plunge Aladdin into the deepest poverty. Unluckily, Aladdin had gone a-hunting for 8 days, which gave the magician plenty of time. He bought a dozen copper lamps, put them into a basket, and went to the palace crying, "New lamps for the old," followed by a jeering crowd. The princess, sitting in the hall of 24 windows, sent a slave to find out what the noise was about, who came back laughing, so that the princess scolded her. "Madame," replied the slave, "who can help laughing to see an old fool offering to exchange fine new lamps for old ones?" Another slave, hearing this, said, "There's an old one on the cornice there, which he can have." Now this was the magic lamp, which Aladdin had left there, as he could not take it out hunting with him. The princess, not knowing its value, laughingly bade the slave take it and make the exchange. She went and said to the magician, "Give me a new lamp for this." He snatched it, and bade the slave take her choice amid the jeers of the crowd. Little he cared, but left off crying his lamps, and went out of the city gates to a lonely place, where he remained till nightfall. When he pulled out the lamp and rubbed it, the genie appeared, and at the magician's command carried him, together with the palace and the princess in it, to a lonely place in Africa. Next morning the Sultan looked out of the window towards Aladdin's palace and rubbed his eyes, for it was gone. He sent for the vizir, and asked what had become of the palace. The vizir looked out too, and was lost in astonishment. He again put it down to enchantment, and this time the Sultan believed him, and sent 30 men on horseback to fetch Aladdin in chains. They met him riding home, bound him, and forced him to go with them on foot. The people, however, who loved him, followed armed, to see that he came to no harm. He was carried before the Sultan, who ordered the executioner to cut off his head. The executioner made Aladdin kneel down, bandaged his eyes, and raised his scimitar to strike. At that instant the vizir, who saw that the crowd had forced their way into the courtyard and were scaling the walls to rescue Aladdin, called to the executioner to stay his hand. The people, indeed, looked so threatening that the Sultan gave way and ordered Aladdin to be unbound, and pardoned him in the sight of the crowd. Aladdin now begged to know what he had done. "False wretch," said the Sultan, "come hither," and showed him from the window the place where his palace had stood. Aladdin was so amazed that he could not say a word. "Where is my palace and my daughter?" demanded the Sultan. "For the first I am not so deeply concerned, but my daughter I must have, and you must find her or lose your head." Aladdin begged for 40 days in which to find her, promising if he failed to return and suffer death at the Sultan's pleasure. His prayer was granted, and he went forth sadly from the Sultan's presence. For 3 days he wandered about like a madman, asking everyone what had become of his palace, but they only laughed and pitied him. He came to the banks of a river and knelt down to say his prayers before throwing himself in. In so doing he rubbed the magic ring he still wore. The genie he had seen in the cave appeared, and asked his will. "Save my life, genie," said the Aladdin, "and bring my palace back." "That is not in my power," said the genie. "I am only the slave of the ring. You must ask the slave of the lamp." "Even so," said Aladdin, "but thou canst take me to the palace, and set me down under my dear wife's window." He at once found himself in Africa, under the window of the princess, and fell asleep out of sheer weariness. He was awakened by the singing of the birds, and his heart was lighter. He saw plainly that all his misfortunes were owing to the loss of the lamp, and vainly wondered who had robbed him of it. That morning the princess rose earlier than she had done since she had been carried into Africa by the magician, whose company she was forced to endure once a day. She, however, treated him so harshly that he dared not live there altogether. As she was dressing, one of her women looked out and saw Aladdin. The princess ran and opened the window, and at the noise she made Aladdin looked up. She called to him to come to her, and great was the joy of these lovers at seeing each other again. After he had kissed her, Aladdin said, "I beg of you, princess, in God's name, before we speak of anything else, for your own sake and mine, tell me what has become of an old lamp I left on the cornice in the hall of 24 windows, when I went a hunting." "Alas," she said, "I am the innocent cause of our sorrows," and told him of the exchange of the lamp. "Now I know," cried Aladdin, "that we have to thank the African magician for this. Where is the lamp?" "He carries it about with him," said the princess. "I know, for he pulled it out of his breast to show me. He wishes me to break my faith with you and marry him, saying that you were beheaded by my father's command. He is forever speaking ill of you, but I only reply by my tears. If I persist, I doubt not that he will use violence." Aladdin comforted her, and left her for a while. He changed clothes with the first person he met in the town, and having bought a certain powder returned to the princess, who let him in by a little side door. "Put on your most beautiful dress," he said to her, "and receive the magician with smiles, leading him to believe that you have forgotten me. Invite him to sup with you, and say you wish to taste the wine of his country. He will go for some, and while he is gone I will tell you what to do." She listened carefully to Aladdin, and when he left her arrayed herself gaily for the first time since she left China. She put on a girdle and a headdress of diamonds, and seeing in a glass that she looked more beautiful than ever, received the magician, saying to his great amazement, "I have made up my mind that Aladdin is dead, and that all my tears will not bring him back to me, so I am resolved to mourn no more, and have therefore invited you to sup with me. But I am tired of the wines of China, and would fain taste those of Africa." The magician flew to his cellar, and the princess put the powder Aladdin had given her in her cup. When he returned she asked him to drink her health in the wine of Africa, handing him her cup in exchange for his as a sign she was reconciled to him. Before drinking the magician made her a speech in praise of her beauty, but the princess cut him short, saying, "Let me drink first, and you shall say what you will afterwards." She set her cup to her lips and kept it there, while the magician drained his to the dregs, and fell back lifeless. The princess then opened the door to Aladdin, and flung her arms round his neck, but Aladdin put her away, bidding her to leave him, as he had more to do. He then went to the dead magician, took the lamp out of his vest, and bade the genie carry the palace and all in it back to China. This was done, and the princess in her chamber only felt 2 little shocks, and little thought she was at home again. The Sultan, who was sitting in his closet mourning for his lost daughter, happened to look up, and rubbed his eyes, for there stood the palace as before. He hastened thither, and Aladdin received him in the hall of 24 windows, with the princess at his side. Aladdin told him what had happened, and showed him the dead body of the magician, that he might believe. A 10 days' feast was proclaimed, and it seemed as if Aladdin might now live the rest of his life in peace, but it was not to be. The African magician had a younger brother, who was, if possible, more wicked and more cunning than himself. He travelled to China to avenge his brother's death, and went to visit a pious woman called Fatima, thinking she might be of use to him. He entered her cell and clapped a dagger to her breast, telling her to rise and do his bidding on pain of death. He changed clothes with her, coloured his face like hers, put on her veil, and murdered her, that she might tell no tales. Then he went towards the palace of Aladdin, and all the people, thinking he was the holy woman, gathered round him, kissing his hands and begging his blessing. When he got to the palace there was such a noise going on round him that the princess bade her slave look out the window and ask what was the matter. The slave said it was the holy woman curing people by her touch of their ailments, whereupon the princess, who had long desired to see Fatima, sent for her. On coming to the princess, the magician offered up a prayer for her health and prosperity. When he had done, the princess made him sit by her, and begged him to stay with her always. The false Fatima, who wished for nothing better, consented, but kept his veil down for fear of discovery. The princess showed him the hall, and asked him what he thought of it. "It is truly beautiful," said the false Fatima. "In my mind it wants but one thing." "And what is that?" said the princess. "If only a roc's egg," replied he, "were hung up from the middle of this dome, it would be the wonder of the world." After this the princess could think of nothing but a roc's egg, and when Aladdin returned from hunting he found her in a very ill humour. He begged to know what was amiss, and she told him that all her pleasure in the hall was spoilt for the want of a roc's egg hanging from the dome. "That is all?" replied Aladdin. "You shall soon be happy." He left her and rubbed the lamp, and when the genie appeared, commanded him to bring a roc's egg. The genie gave such a loud and terrible shriek that the hall shook. "Wretch!" he cried, "is it not enough that I have done everything for you, but you must command me to bring my master and hang him up in the midst of this dome? You and your wife and your palace deserve to be burnt to ashes, but this request does not come from you, but from the brother of the African magician whom you destroyed. He is now in your palace disguised as the holy woman, whom he murdered. He it was who put this wish into your wife's head. Take care of yourself, for he means to kill you." So saying, the genie disappeared. Aladdin went back to the princess, saying his head ached, and requesting that the holy Fatima should be fetched to lay her hands on it. But when the magician came near, Aladdin, seizing his dagger, pierced him to the heart. "What have you done?" cried the princess. "You have killed the holy woman." "Not so," replied Aladdin, "but a wicked magician," and told her of how she had been deceived. After this Aladdin and his wife lived in peace. He succeeded the Sultan when he died, and reigned for many years, leaving behind him a long line of kings. End of chapter 31. Recording by Floyd Wilde. newatmake.org.nz.
Chapter 32 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Valerie. The Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 32, The Adventures of Haroun-al-Raschid, Caliph of Baghdad. The Caliph Haroun-al-Raschid sat in his palace, wondering if there was anything left in the world that could possibly give him a few hours' amusement, when Jafar the Grand Vizier, his old and true friend, suddenly appeared before him. Bowing low, he waited, as was his duty, till his master spoke. But Haroun-al-Raschid merely turned his head and looked at him and sank back into his former weary posture. Now Jafar had something of importance to say to the Caliph, and had no intention of being put off by mere silence. So with another low bow in front of the throne, he began to speak. "Commander of the faithful," said he, "I have taken on myself to remind your highness that you have undertaken secretly to observe for yourself the manner in which justice is done and order is kept throughout the city. This is the day you have set apart to devote to this object, and perhaps, in fulfilling this duty, you may find some distraction from the melancholy to which, as I see to my sorrow, you are a prey." "You are right," returned the Caliph. "I had forgotten all about it. Go and change your coat, and I will change mine." A few moments later they both re-entered the hall, disguised as foreign merchants, and passed through a secret door out into the open country. Here they turned towards the Euphrates, and crossing the river in a small boat, walked through that part of the town which lay along the further bank, without seeing anything to call for their interference. Much pleased with the peace and good order of the city, the Caliph and his vizier made their way to a bridge, which led straight back to the palace, and had already crossed it when they were stopped by an old and blind man, who begged for alms. The Caliph gave him a piece of money and was passing on, but the blind man seized his hand and held him fast. "Charitable person," he said, "whoever you may be, grant me yet another prayer. Strike me, I beg of you, one blow. I have deserved it richly, and even a more severe penalty." The Caliph, much surprised at this request, replied gently, "My good man, that which you ask is impossible. Of what use would my alms be if I treated you so ill?" As he spoke, he tried to loosen the grasp of the blind beggar. "My lord," answered the man, "pardon my boldness and my persistence. Take back your money, and give me the blow which I crave. I have sworn a solemn oath that I will receive nothing without receiving chastisement. And if you knew all, you would feel that the punishment is not a tenth of what I deserve." Moved by these words, and perhaps still more by the fact that he had other business to attend to, the Caliph yielded and struck him lightly on the shoulder. Then he continued his road, followed by the blessing of the blind man. When they were out of earshot, he said to the vizier, "There must be something very odd to make that man act so. I should like to find out what is the reason. Go back to him, tell him who I am, and order him to come without fail to the palace tomorrow, after the hour of evening prayer. So the Grand Vizier went back to the bridge, gave the blind beggar first a piece of money and then a blow, delivered the Caliph's message, and rejoined his master. They passed on towards the palace, but walking through a square, they came upon a crowd watching a young and well-dressed man who was urging a horse at full speed round the open space, using at the same time his spurs and whip so unmercifully that the animal was all covered with foam and blood. The Caliph, astonished at this proceeding, inquired of a passer-by what it all meant, but no one could tell him anything, except that every day at the same hour the same thing took place. Still wondering, he passed on, and for the moment he had to content himself with telling the vizier to command the horseman also to appear before him at the same time as the blind man. The next day, after evening prayer, the Caliph entered the hall and was followed by the vizier, bringing with him the 2 men of whom we have spoken, and a third, with whom we have nothing to do. They all bowed themselves low before the throne, and then the Caliph bade them rise and asked the blind man his name. "Baba-Abdalla, your highness," he said. "Baba-Abdalla," returned the Caliph, "your way of asking alms yesterday seemed to me so strange that I almost commanded you then and there to cease from causing such a public scandal. But I have sent for you to inquire what was your motive in making such a curious vow. When I know the reason, I shall be able to judge whether you can be permitted to continue to practice it, for I cannot help thinking that it sets a very bad example to others. Tell me therefore the whole truth, and conceal nothing." These words troubled the heart of Baba-Abdalla, who prostrated himself at the feet of the Caliph. Then rising, he answered, "Commander of the faithful, I crave your pardon humbly for my persistence in beseeching your highness to do an action which appears on the face of it to be without any meaning. No doubt in the eyes of men it has none, but I look on it as a slight expiation for a fearful sin of what I have been guilty, and if your highness will deign to listen to my tale, you will see that no punishment could atone for the crime." End of chapter 32. Recorded by Valerie in Washington, D.C.
Chapter 33 of Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 33. The Story of the Blind Baba-Abdalla. I was born, Commander of the Faithful, in Bagdad, and was left an orphan while I was yet a very young man, for my parents died within a few days of each other. I had inherited from them a small fortune, which I worked hard night and day to increase, till at last I found myself the owner of 80 camels. These I hired out to traveling merchants, whom I frequently accompanied on their various journeys, and always returned with large profits. One day I was coming back from Balsora, whither I had taken a supply of goods, intended for India, and halted at noon in a lonely place, which promised rich pasture for my camels. I was resting in the shade under a tree, when a dervish, going on foot towards Balsora, sat down by my side, and I inquired whence he had come and to what place he was going. We soon made friends, and after we had asked each other the usual questions, we produced the food we had with us and satisfied our hunger. While we were eating, the dervish happened to mention that in a spot only a little way off from where we were sitting, there was hidden a treasure so great that if my 80 camels were loaded till they could carry no more, the hiding place would seem as full as if it had never been touched. At this news I became almost beside myself with joy and greed. I flung my arms around the neck of the dervish, exclaiming, "Good dervish, I see plainly that the riches of this world are nothing to you. Therefore of what use is the knowledge of this treasure to you? Alone and on foot, you could carry away a mere handful. But tell me where it is, and I will load my 80 camels with it, and give you one of them as a token of my gratitude." Certainly my offer does not sound very magnificent, but it was great to me, for at his words a wave of covetousness had swept over my heart, and I almost felt as if the 79 camels that were left were nothing in comparison. The dervish saw quite well what was passing in my mind, but he did not show what he thought of my proposal. "My brother," he answered quietly, "you know as well as I do, that you are behaving unjustly. It was open to me to keep my secret, and to reserve the treasure for myself, but the fact that I have told you of its existence shows that I had confidence in you, and that I had hoped to earn your gratitude forever by making your fortune as well as mine. But, before I reveal to you the secret of the treasure, you must swear that, after we have loaded the camels with as much as they can carry, you will give half to me, and let us go our own ways. I think you will see that this is fair, for if you present me with 40 camels, I on my side will give you the means of buying 1,000 more." I could not of course deny that what the dervish said was perfectly reasonable, but, in spite of that, the thought that the dervish would be as rich as I was unbearable to me. Still, there was no use in discussing the matter, and I had to accept his conditions or bewail to the end of my life the loss of immense wealth. So I collected my camels and we set out together under the guidance of the dervish. After walking some time, we reached what looked like a valley, but with such a narrow entrance that my camels could only pass one by one. The little valley, or open space, was shut up by 2 mountains, whose sides were formed of straight cliffs, which no human being could climb. When we were exactly between these mountains, the dervish stopped. "Make your camels lie down in this open space," he said, "so that we can easily load them. Then we will go to the treasure." I did what I was bid, and rejoined the dervish, whom I found trying to kindle a fire out of some dry wood. As soon as it was alight, he threw on it a handful of perfumes, and pronounced a few words that I did not understand, and immediately a thick column of smoke rose high into the air. He separated the smoke into 2 columns, and then I saw a rock, which stood like a pillar between the 2 mountains, slowly open, and a splendid palace appear within. But, Commander of the Faithful, the love of gold had taken such possession of my heart that I could not even stop to examine the riches, but fell upon the first pile of gold within my reach, and began to heap it into a sack that I had brought with me. The dervish likewise set to work, but I soon noticed that he confined himself to collecting precious stones, and I felt I should be wise to follow his example. At length the camels were loaded with as much as they could carry, and nothing remained but to seal up the treasure and go our ways. Before, however, this was done, the dervish went up to a great golden vase, beautifully chased, and took from it a small wooden box, which he hid in the bosom of his dress, merely saying that it contained a special kind of ointment. Then he once more kindled the fire, threw on the perfume, and murmured the unknown spell, and the rock closed, and stood whole as before. The next thing was to divide the camels, and to charge them with the treasure, after which we each took command of our own and marched out of the valley, till we reached the place in the high road where the routes diverge, and then we parted, the dervish going towards Balsora, and I to Bagdad. We embraced each other tenderly, and I poured out my gratitude for the honor he had done me, in singling me out for this great wealth, and having said a hearty farewell, we turned our backs, and hastened after our camels. I had hardly come up with mine, when the demon of envy filled my soul. "What does a dervish want with riches like that?" I said to myself. "He alone has the secret of the treasure, and can always get as much as he wants." And I halted my camels by the roadside, and ran back after him. I was a quick runner, and it did not take me very long to come up with him. "My brother," I exclaimed, as soon as I could speak, "almost at the moment of our leave-taking, a reflection occurred to me, which is perhaps new to you. You are a dervish by profession, and live a very quiet life, only caring to do good, and careless of things of this world. You do not realize the burden that you lay upon yourself, when you gather into your hands such a great wealth, besides the fact that no one who is not accustomed to camels from his birth, can ever manage the stubborn beasts. If you are wise, you will not encumber yourself with more than 30, and you will find those trouble enough." "You are right," replied the dervish, who understood me quite well, but did not wish to fight over the matter. "I confess I had not thought about it. Choose any 10 you like, and drive them before you." I selected 10 of the best camels, and we proceeded along the road to rejoin those I had left behind. I had got what I wanted, but I had found the dervish so easy to deal with, that I rather regretted I had not asked for 10 more. I looked back. He had only gone a few paces, and I called after him. "My brother," I said, "I am unwilling to part from you without pointing out what I think you scarcely grasp, that large experience of camel driving is necessary to anyone who intends to keep together a troop of 30. In your own interest, I feel sure you would be much happier if you entrusted 10 more of them to me, for with my practice it is all one to me if I take 2 or 100. As before, the dervish made no difficulties, and I drove off my 10 camels in triumph, only leaving him with 20 for his share. I had now 60, and anyone might have imagined that I should be content. But, Commander of the Faithful, there is a proverb that says, "The more one has, the more one wants." So it was with me. I could not rest as long as one solitary camel remained to the dervish, and returning to him I redoubled my prayers and embraces and promises of eternal gratitude, till the last 20 were in my hands. "Make good use of them, my brother," said the holy man. "Remember, riches sometimes have wings if we keep them for ourselves, and the poor are at our gates expressly that we may help them." My eyes were so blinded by gold that I paid no heed to his wise counsel, and only looked about for something else to grasp. Suddenly I remembered the little box of ointment that the dervish had hidden, and which most likely contained a treasure more precious than all the rest. Giving him one last embrace, I observed accidentally, "What are you going to do with the little box of ointment? It seems hardly worth taking with you. You might as well let me have it." And really, a dervish who has given up the world has no need of ointment. Oh, if he had only refused my request! But then, supposing he had, I should have gotten possession of it by force, so great was the madness that had laid hold upon me. However, far from refusing it, the dervish at once held it out, saying gracefully, "Take it, my friend, and if there is anything else I can do to make you happy, you must let me know." Directly the box was in my hands, I wrenched off the cover. "As you are so kind," I said, "tell me, I pray you, what are the virtues of this ointment?" "They are most curious and interesting," replied the dervish. "If you apply a little of it to your left eye, you will behold in an instant all the treasures hidden in the bowels of the earth. But beware lest you touch your right eye with it, or your sight will be destroyed forever." His words excited my curiosity to the highest pitch. "Make trial on me, I implore you," I cried, holding out the box to the dervish. "You will know how to do it better than I. I am burning with impatience to test its charms." The dervish took the box I had extended to him, and, bidding me shut my left eye, touched it gently with the ointment. When I opened it again, I saw spread out, as it were before me, treasures of every kind and without number. But as all this time I had been obliged to keep my right eye closed, which was very fatiguing, I begged the dervish to apply the ointment to that eye also. "If you insist upon it, I will do it," answered the dervish. "But you must remember what I told you just now, that if it touches your right eye you will become blind on the spot." Unluckily, in spite of my having proved the truth of the dervish's words in so many instances, I was firmly convinced that he was now keeping concealed from me some hidden and precious virtue of the ointment, so I turned a deaf ear to all he said. "My brother," I replied smiling, "I see you are joking. It is not natural that the same ointment should have 2 such exactly opposite effects." "It is true all the same," answered the dervish, "and it would be well for you if you believed my word." But I would not believe, and, dazzled by the greed of avarice, I thought that if one eye should show me riches, the other might teach me how to get possession of them, and I continued to press the dervish to anoint my right eye, but this he resolutely declined to do. "After having conferred such benefits on you," said he, "I am loath indeed to work you such evil. Think what it is to be blind, and do not force me to do what you will repent as long as you live." It was of no use. "My brother," I said firmly, "pray say no more, but do what I ask. You have most generously responded to my wishes up to this time. Do not spoil my recollection of you for a thing of such little consequence. Let what will happen I take it on my own head and will never reproach you." "Since you are determined upon it," he answered with a sigh, "there is no use talking," and taking the ointment he laid some on my right eye, which was tight shut. When I tried to open it, heavy clouds of darkness floated before me. I was as blind as you see me now. "Miserable dervish!" I shrieked. "So it is true after all! Into what a bottomless pit has my lust after gold plunged me! Ah! Now that my eyes are closed they are really opened. I know that all my sufferings are caused by myself alone. But, good brother, you, who are so kind and charitable, and know the secrets of such vast learning, have you nothing that will give me back my sight?" "Unhappy man," replied the dervish, "it is not my fault that this has befallen you, but it is a just chastisement. The blindness of your heart has wrought the blindness of your body. Yes, I have secrets that you have seen in the short time that we have known each other, but I have none that will give you back your sight. You have proved yourself unworthy of the riches that were given you. Now they have passed into my hands, whence they will flow into the hands of others less greedy and ungrateful than you." The dervish said no more and left me, speechless with shame and confusion, and so wretched that I stood rooted to the spot, while he collected the 80 camels and proceeded on his way to Balsora. It was in vain that I entreated him not to leave me, but at least to take me within reach of the first passing caravan. He was deaf to my prayers and cries, and I should have soon been dead of hunger and misery if some merchants had not come along the track the following day and kindly brought me back to Bagdad. From a rich man I had in one moment become a beggar, and up to this time I have lived solely on the alms that have been bestowed on me. But, in order to expiate the sin of avarice, which was my undoing, I oblige each passer-by to give me a blow. This, Commander of the Faithful, is my story." When the blind man had ended, the Caliph addressed him: "Baba-Abdalla, truly your sin is great, but you have suffered enough. Henceforth repent in private, for I will see that enough money is given you day by day for all your wants." At these words Baba-Abdalla flung himself at the Caliph's feet, and prayed that honor and happiness might be his portion forever. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 34. The Story of Sidi-Nouman. The Caliph Haroun-al-Raschid was much pleased with the tale of the blind man and the dervish, and when it was finished he turned to the young man who had ill-treated his horse and inquired his name also. The young man replied that he was called Sidi-Nouman. "Sidi-Nouman," observed the Caliph, "I have seen horses broken all my life long, and have even broken them myself, but I have never seen any horse broken in such a barbarous manner as by you yesterday." Everyone who looked on was indignant and blamed you loudly. As for myself, I was so angry that I was very nearly disclosing who I was, and putting a stop to it at once. Still, you have not the air of a cruel man, and I would gladly believe that you did not act in this way without some reason. As I am told that it was not the first time and indeed that every day you are to be seen flogging and spurring your horse, I wish to come to the bottom of the matter. But tell me the whole truth and conceal nothing." Sidi-Nouman changed colour as he heard these words, and his manner grew confused, but he saw plainly that there was no help for it. So he prostrated himself before the throne of the Caliph and tried to obey, but the words stuck in his throat, and he remained silent. The Caliph, accustomed though he was to instant obedience, guessed something of what was passing in the young man's mind, and sought to put him at his ease. "Sidi-Nouman," he said, "do not think of me as the Caliph, but merely as a friend who would like to hear your story. If there is anything in it that you are afraid may offend me, take courage, for I pardon you beforehand. Speak then openly and without fear, as to one who knows and loves you." Reassured by the kindness of the Caliph, Sidi-Nouman at length began his tale. "Commander of the Faithful," said he, "dazzled though I am by the lustre of your Highness's presence, I will do my best to satisfy your wishes. I am by no means perfect, but I am not naturally cruel, neither do I take pleasure in breaking the law. I admit that the treatment of my horse is calculated to give your Highness a bad opinion of me, and to set an evil example to others, yet I have not chastised it without reason, and I have hopes that I shall be judged more worthy of pity than punishment. Commander of the Faithful, I will not trouble to describe my birth. It is not of sufficient distinction to deserve your Highness's attention. My ancestors were careful people, and I inherited enough money to enable me to live comfortably, though without show. Having therefore a modest fortune, the only thing wanting to my happiness was a wife who would return my affection. But this blessing I was not destined to get, for on the very day after my marriage, my bride began to try my patience in every way that was most hard to bear. Now, seeing that the customs of our land oblige us to marry without even beholding the person with whom we are to pass our lives, a man has of course no right to complain as long as his wife is not absolutely repulsive or is not positively deformed. And whatever defects her body may have, pleasant ways and good behavior will go far to remedy. The first time I saw my wife unveiled, and when she had been brought to my house with the usual ceremonies, I was enchanted to find that I had not been deceived in regard to the account that had been given me of her beauty. I began my married life in high spirits and the best hopes of happiness. The following day a grand dinner was served to us, but as my wife did not appear, I ordered a servant to call her. Still she did not come, and I waited impatiently for some time. At last she entered the room, and she took our places at the table, and plates of rice were set before us. I ate mine as was natural, and with a spoon, but great was my surprise to notice that my wife, instead of doing the same, drew from her pocket a little case from which she selected a long pin, and by the help of this pin conveyed her rice grain by grain to her mouth. "Amina!" I exclaimed in astonishment, "is that the way you eat rice at home? And did you do it because your appetite was so small, or did you wish to count the grains so that you might never eat more than a certain number? If it was from economy, and you are anxious to teach me not to be wasteful, you have no cause for alarm. We shall never ruin ourselves in that way. Our fortune is large enough for all our needs. Therefore, dear Amina, do not seek to check yourself, but eat as much as you desire, as I do." In reply to my affectionate words, I expected a cheerful answer, yet Amina said nothing at all, but continued to pick her rice as before, only at longer and longer intervals, and instead of trying the other dishes, all she did was to put every now and then a crumb of bread into her mouth that would not have made a meal for a sparrow. I felt provoked by her obstinacy, and to excuse her to myself as far as I could, I suggested that perhaps she had never been used to eat in the company of men, and that her family might have taught her that she ought to behave prudently and discreetly in the presence of her husband. Likewise, that she might either have dined already or intend to do so in her own apartments. So I took no further notice, and when I had finished, left the room secretly much vexed at her strange conduct. The same thing occurred at supper, and although all through the next day, whenever we ate together, it was quite clear that no woman could live upon 2 or 3 breadcrumbs and a few grains of rice, and I determined to find out how and when she got food. I pretended not to pay attention to anything she did, in the hope that little by little she would get accustomed to me and become more friendly, but I soon saw that my expectations were quite vain. One night I was lying with my eyes closed and to all appearance sound asleep, when Amina arose softly and dressed herself without making the slightest sound. I could not imagine what she was going to do, and as my curiosity was great, I made up my mind to follow her. When she was fully dressed, she stole quietly from the room. The instant she had let the curtain fall behind her, I flung a garment on my shoulders and a pair of slippers on my feet. Looking from a lattice which opened into the court, I saw her in the act of passing through the street door, which she carefully left open. It was bright moonlight, so I easily managed to keep her in sight, till she entered a cemetery not far from the house. There I hid myself under the shadow of the wall and crouched down cautiously, and hardly was I concealed when I saw my wife approaching in company with a ghoul, one of those demons which, as your Highness is aware, wander about the country, making their lairs in deserted buildings and springing out upon unwary travellers whose flesh they eat. If no live being goes their way, then they betake themselves to cemeteries and feed upon dead bodies. I was nearly struck dumb with horror on seeing my wife with this hideous female ghoul. They passed by me without noticing me, began to dig up a corpse which had been buried that day, and then sat down on the edge of the grave to enjoy their frightful repast, talking quietly and cheerfully all the while, though I was too far off to hear what they said. When they finished, they threw back the body into the grave and heaped back the earth on it. I made no effort to disturb them, and returned quickly to the house, when I took care to leave the door open as I had previously found it. Then I got back into bed and pretended to sleep soundly. A short time after Amina entered, as quietly as she had gone out, she undressed and stole into bed, congratulating herself apparently on the cleverness with which she had managed her expedition. As may be guessed, after such a scene, it was long before I could close my eyes, and at the first sound which called the faithful to prayer, I put on my clothes and went to the mosque. But even prayer did not restore peace to my troubled spirit, and I could not face my wife until I had made up my mind what future course I would pursue in regard to her. I therefore spent the morning roaming about from one garden to another, turning over various plans for compelling my wife to give up her horrible ways. I thought of using the violence to make her submit, but felt reluctant to be unkind to her. Besides, I had an instinct that gentle means had the best chance of success. So, a little soothed, I turned towards home, which I reached about the hour of dinner. As soon as I appeared, Amina ordered dinner to be served, and we sat down together. As usual, she persisted in only picking a few grains of rice, and I resolved to speak to her at once of what lay so heavily in my heart. "Amina," I said as quietly as possible, "you must have guessed the surprise I felt when the day after our marriage you declined to eat anything but a few morsels of rice, and altogether behaved in such a manner that most husbands would have been deeply wounded. However, I had patience with you, and only tried to tempt your appetite by the choicest dishes I could invent, and still, Amina, it seems to me that there be some among them as sweet to the taste as the flesh of a corpse." I had no sooner uttered these words than Amina, who instantly understood that I had followed her to the graveyard, was seized with a passion beyond any that I had ever witnessed. Her face became purple, her eyes looked as if they could start from her head, and she positively foamed with rage. I watched her with terror, wondering what would happen next, but little thinking what would be the end of her fury. She seized a vessel of water that stood at hand, and plunging her hand in it, murmured some words I failed to catch. Then, sprinkling it on my face, she cried madly, "Wretch, receive the reward of your prying, and become a dog!" The words were not out of her mouth when, without feeling conscious that any change was passing over me, I suddenly knew that I had ceased to be a man. In the greatness of the shock and surprise, for I had no idea that Amina was a magician, I never dreamed of running away, and stood rooted to the spot while Amina grasped a stick and began to beat me. Indeed, her blows were so heavy that I only wonder they did not kill me at once. However, they succeeded in rousing me from my stupor, and I dashed into the courtyard, followed closely by Amina, who made frantic dives at me, which I was not quick enough to dodge. At last she got tired of pursuing me, or else a new trick entered into her head, which would give me speedy and painful death. She opened the gate leading into the street, intended to crush me as I passed through. Dog though I was, I saw through her design, and stung into presence of mind by the greatness of the danger. I timed my movements so well that I contrived to rush through, and only the nip of my tail received a squeeze as she banged the gate. I was safe, but my tail hurt me horribly, and I yelped and howled so loud all along the streets that the other boys came and attacked me, which made matters no better. In order to avoid them, I took refuge in a cook shop, where tongues and sheep's head was sold. At first the owner showed me great kindness, and drove away the other dogs that were still at my heels, while I crept into the darkest corner. But though I was safe for the moment, I was not destined to remain long under his protection, for he was one of those who hold all dogs to be unclean, and that all the washing in the world would hardly purify you from their contact. So after my enemies had gone to seek other prey, he tried to lure me from my corner in order to force me into the street, but I refused to come out of my hole, and spent the night in sleep, which I sorely needed after the pain inflicted on me by Amina. I have no wish to weary your Highness by dwelling on the sad thoughts which accompanied my change of shape, but it may interest you to hear that the next morning my host went out early to do his marketing, and returned laden with the sheep's heads and tongues and trotters that formed his stock and trade for the day. The smell of meat attracted various hungry dogs in the neighbourhood, and they gathered around the door begging for some bits. I stole out of my corner and stood with them. In spite of his objection to dogs as unclean animals, my protector was a kind-hearted man, and knowing I had eaten nothing since yesterday, he threw me bigger and better bits than those which fell to the share of the other dogs, all to no purpose. When I had finished, I tried to go back into the shop, but this he would not allow, and stood so firmly at the entrance with a stout stick that I was forced to give it up and seek some other home. A few paces further on was a baker's shop, which seemed to have a gay and merry man for master. At that moment he was having his breakfast, and though I gave no signs of hunger, he at once threw me a piece of bread. Before gobbling it up, as most dogs are in the habit of doing, I bowed my head and wagged my tail, in token of thanks, and he understood and smiled pleasantly. I really did not want the bread at all, but felt it would be ungracious to refuse, so I ate it slowly, in order that he might see that I only did it out of politeness. He understood this also, and seemed quite willing to let me stay in his shop, so I sat down with my face to the door, to show that I only asked his protection. This he gave me, and indeed encouraged me to come into the house itself, giving me a corner where I might sleep, without being in anybody's way. The kindness heaped on me by this excellent man was far greater than I had ever have expected. He was always affectionate in his manner of treating me, and I shared his breakfast, dinner, and supper, while on my side I gave him all the gratitude and attachment to which he had the right. I sat with my eyes fixed on him, and he never left the house without having me at his heels, and if I ever happened that when he was preparing to go out I was asleep and did not notice, he would call, "Rufus, Rufus," for that was the name he gave me. Some weeks passed in this way, when one day a woman came in to buy bread. In paying for it, she laid down several pieces of money, one of which was bad. The baker perceived this and declined to take it, demanding another in its place. The woman, for her part, refused to take it back, declaring it was perfectly good, but the baker would have nothing to do with it. "It's really such a bad imitation," he exclaimed at last, "that even my dog would not be taken in. Here, Rufus, Rufus!" And hearing his voice, I jumped on to the counter. The baker threw down the money before me and said, "Find out if there is a bad coin." I looked at each in turn, and then laid my paw on the false one, glancing at the same time at my master, so as to point it out. The baker, who had of course been only in joke, was exceedingly surprised at my cleverness, and the woman, who had at last convinced that the man spoke the truth, produced another piece of money in its place. When she had gone, my master was so pleased that he told all the neighbours what I had done, and made a great deal more of it than there really was. The neighbours very naturally declined to believe his story, and tried me several times with all the bad money they could collect together, but I never failed to stand the test triumphantly. Soon the shop was filled from morning till night with people who, on the pretence of buying bread, came to see if I was as clever as I was reported to be. The baker drove a roaring trade, and admitted that I was worth my weight in gold to him. Of course, There were plenty who envied him his large custom, and many was the pitfall set for me, so that he never dared to let me out of his sight. One day a woman, who had not been in the shop before, came to ask for bread like the rest. As usual, I was lying on the counter, and she threw down 6 coins before me, one of which was false. I detected it at once and put my paw on it, looking as if I did so at the woman. "Yes," she said, nodding her head, "you're quite right. That is the one." She stood gazing at me attentively for some time, then paid for the bread and left the room, making a sign for me to follow her secretly. Now, my thoughts were always running on some means of shaking off the spell laid on me, and noticing the way in which this woman had looked at me, the idea entered my head that perhaps she might have guessed what had happened, and in this I was not deceived. However, I let her go on a little way, and merely stood at the door watching her. She turned, and seeing that I was quite still, she again beckoned to me. The baker all this while was busy with his oven, and had forgotten all about me, so I stole out softly and ran after the woman. When we came to a house which was some distance off, she opened the door, and then said to me, "Come in, come in. You will never be sorry that you followed me." When I had entered, she fastened the door, and took me into a large room, where a beautiful girl was working at a piece of embroidery. "My daughter," exclaimed my guide, "I have brought you the famous dog belonging to the baker, which can tell good money from bad. You know that when I first heard of him, I told you I was sure he must be really a man, changed into a dog by magic. Today I went to the baker's to prove for myself the truth of the story, and persuaded the dog to follow me here. Now, what do you say?" "You're right, mother," replied the girl, and rising, she dipped her hand into a vessel of water. Then sprinkling it over me, she said, "If you were born a dog, remain dog, but if you were born man, by virtue of this water, resume your proper form." In one moment the spell was broken. The dog's shape vanished as if it had never been, and it was a man who stood before her. Overcome with gratitude at my deliverance, I flung myself at her feet and kissed the hem of her garment. "How can I thank you for your goodness towards a stranger, and for what you have done? Henceforth I am your slave. Deal with me as you will." Then, in order to explain how I came to be changed into a dog, I told her my whole story, and finished with rendering the mother the thanks due to her for the happiness she had brought me. "Sidi-Nouman," returned the daughter, "say no more about the obligation you are under to us. The knowledge that we have been of service to you is ample payment. Let us speak of Amna, your wife, with whom I was acquainted before her marriage. I was aware that she was a magician, and she knew too that I had studied the same art under the same mistress. We met often, going to the same baths, but we did not like each other, and never sought to become friends. As to what concerns you, it is not enough to have broken your spell. She must be punished for her wickedness. Remain for a moment with my mother, I beg," she added hastily. "I will return shortly." Left alone with the mother, I again expressed the gratitude I felt to her as well as to her daughter. "My daughter," she answered, "is, as you see, as accomplished a magician as Amna herself. You would be astonished at the amount of good she does by her knowledge. That is why I have never interfered, otherwise I would have put a stop to it long ago." As she spoke, her daughter entered with a small bottle in her hand. "Sidi-Nouman," she said, "the books I have just consulted tell me that Amna is not home at present, but she could and should return at any moment. I have likewise found out by their means that she pretends before the servants great uneasiness as to your absence. She has circulated a story that while at dinner with her, you remembered some important business that had to be done at once, and left the house without shutting the door. By this means a dog had strayed in, which was forced to get rid of by a stick. Go home, then, without delay, and await Amna's return in your room. When she comes in, go down to meet her, and in her surprise she will try to run away. Then have this bottle ready, and dash the water it contains over her, saying boldly, 'Receive the reward of your crimes.' This is all I have to tell you." Everything happened exactly as the young magician had foretold. I had not been in my house many minutes before Amna returned, and as she approached I stepped in front of her with the water in my hand. She gave one loud cry and turned to the door, but it was too late. I had already dashed the water in her face and spoken the magic words. Amna disappeared, and in her place stood the horse you saw me beating yesterday. That, Commander of the Faithful, is my story, and may I venture to hope that, now you have heard the reason of my conduct, your Highness will not think this wicked woman too harshly treated." "Sidi-Nouman," replied the Caliph, "your story is indeed a strange one, and there is no excuse to be offered for your wife. But without condemning your treatment of her, I wish you to reflect how much she must have suffered from being changed into an animal, and I hope you will let that punishment be enough. I do not order you to insist upon the young magician finding the means to restore, because I know that once women such as she begin to work evil, they never leave off, and I should only bring down on your head a vengeance far worse than the one you have undergone already." End of chapter 34, recording by Naila Baig-Ansari, Karachi, Pakistan.
Chapter 35 of Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 35. The Story of Ali-Colia, Merchant of Baghdad. In the reign of Haroun-al-Raschid, there lived in Baghdad a merchant named Ali-Colia, who, having neither wife nor child, contented himself with the modest profits produced by his trade. He had spent some years quite happily in the house his father had left him, when 3 nights running he dreamed that an old man had appeared to him, and reproached him for having neglected the duty of a good Mussulman in delaying so long his pilgrimage to Mecca. Ali-Colia was much troubled by this dream, as he was unwilling to give up his shop and lose all his customers. He had shut his eyes for some time to the necessity of performing this pilgrimage, and tried to atone to his conscience by an extra number of good works, but the dream seemed to him a direct warning, and he resolved to put the journey off no longer. The first thing he did was to sell his furniture and the wares he had in his shop, only reserving to himself such goods as he might trade with on the road. The shop itself he sold also, and easily found a tenant for his private house. The only matter which he could not settle satisfactorily was the safe custody of 1,000 pieces of gold which he wished to leave behind him. After some thought, Ali-Colia hit upon a plan which seemed a safe one. He took a large vase, and placing the money in the bottom of it, filled up the rest with olives. After corking the vase tightly down, he carried it to one of his friends, a merchant like himself, and said to him, "My brother, you have probably heard that I am staffing with a caravan in a few days for Mecca. I have come to ask whether you would do me the favor to keep this vase of olives for me till I come back." The merchant replied readily, "Look, this is the key to my shop. Take it, and put the vase wherever you like. I promise that you shall find it in the same place on your return." A few days later, Ali-Colia mounted the camel that he had laden with merchandise, joined the caravan, and arrived in due time at Mecca. Like the other pilgrims, he visited the sacred mosque, and after all his religious duties were performed, he set out his goods to the best advantage, hoping to gain some customers among the passers-by. Very soon 2 merchants stopped before the pile, and when they had turned it over, one said to the other, "If this man was wise, he would take these things to Cairo, where he would get a much better price than he is likely to do here." Ali-Colia heard the words, and lost no time in following the advice. He packed up his wares, and instead of returning to Baghdad, joined a caravan that was going to Cairo. The results of the journey gladdened his heart. He sold off everything almost directly, and bought a stock of Egyptian curiosities, which he intended to sell at Damascus. But as the caravan with which he would have to travel would not be starting for another 6 weeks, he took the advantage of the delay to visit the pyramids and some of the cities along the banks of the Nile. Now the attractions of Damascus so fascinated the worthy Ali, that he could hardly tear himself away. But at length he remembered that he had a home in Baghdad, meaning to return by way of Aleppo, and after he had crossed the Euphrates to follow the course of the Tigris. But when he had reached Mosul, Ali had made such friends with some of the Persian merchants, that they persuaded him to accompany them to their native land, and even as far as India. So it came to pass that 7 years had slipped by since he had left Baghdad. During all that time the friend with whom he had left the vase of olives had never once thought of him or of it. In fact, it was only a month before Ali-Cogia's actual return that the affair came into his head at all, owing to his wife's remarking one day that it was a long time since she had eaten any olives, and would like some. "That reminds me," said the husband, "that before Ali-Cogia went to Mecca 7 years ago, he left a vase of olives in my care. But really by this time he must be dead, and there is no reason that we should not eat the olives if we like. Give me a light, and I will fetch them and see how they taste." "My husband," answered the wife, "beware, I pray, of doing anything so base. Supposing 7 years have passed without news of Ali-Cogia, he need not be dead for all that, and may come back any day. How shameful it would be to have to confess that you betrayed your trust and broke the seal of the vase. Pay no attention to my idle words. I really have no desire for olives now, and probably after all this time they are no good. I have a presentiment that Ali-Cogia will return, and what will he think of you? Give it up, I entreat." The merchant, however, refused to listen to her advice, sensible though it was. He took a light and a dish and went into his shop. "If you will be so obstinate," said his wife, "I cannot help it, but do not blame me if it turns out ill." When the merchant opened the vase, he found the topmost olives were rotten, and in order to see if the under ones were in better condition, he shook some out into the dish. As they fell out, a few of the gold pieces fell out too. The sight of the money roused all the merchant's greed. He looked into the vase, and saw that all the bottom was filled with gold. He then replaced the olives and returned to his wife. "My wife," he said, as he entered the room, "you were quite right. The olives were rotten, and I have recorked the vase so well that Ali-Cogia will never know that it has been touched." "You would have done better to believe me," replied the wife. "I trust that no harm will come of it." These words made no more impression on the merchant than the others had done, and he spent the whole night in wondering how he could manage to keep the gold if Ali-Cogia should come back and claim his vase. Very early the next morning he went out and bought fresh new olives. He then threw away the old ones, took out the gold and hid it, and filled up the vase with the olives he had bought. This done, he recorked the vase and put it in the same place where it had been left by Ali-Cogia. A month later Ali-Cogia re-entered Bagdad, and as his house was still let he went to an inn, and the following day set out to see his friend the merchant, who received him with open arms and many expressions of surprise. After a few moments given to inquiries, Ali-Cogia begged the merchant to hand him over the vase that he had taken care of for so long. "Oh, certainly," said he, "I am only glad that I could be of use to you in the matter. Here is the key to my shop. You will find the vase in the place where you put it." Ali-Cogia fetched his vase and carried it to his room at the inn, where he opened it. He thrust down his hand but could feel no money, but still was persuaded that it must be there. So he got some plates and vessels from his travelling kit and emptied out the olives. To no purpose, the gold was not there. The poor man was dumb with horror. Then, lifting up his hands, he exclaimed, "Can my old friend really have committed such a crime?" In great haste he went back to the house of the merchant. "My friend," he cried, "you will be astonished to see me again. But I can find nowhere in this vase 1,000 pieces of gold that I placed in the bottom under the olives. Perhaps you may have taken a loan of them for your business purposes. If that is so, you are most welcome. I will only ask that you give me a receipt, and that you pay the money at your leisure." The merchant, who had expected something of the sort, had his reply all ready. "Ali-Cogia," he said, "when you brought me the vase of olives, did I ever touch it? I gave you the key of my shop, and you put it yourself where you liked, and did you not find it exactly in the same spot and in the same state? If you placed any gold in it, it must be there still. I know nothing about that. You only told me there were olives. You can believe me or not, but I have not laid a finger on the vase." Ali-Cogia still tried every means to persuade the merchant to admit the truth. "I love peace," he said, "and shall deeply regret having to resort to harsh measures. Once more, think of your reputation. I shall be in despair if you oblige me to call in the aid of the law." "Ali-Cogia," answered the merchant, "you allow that it was a vase of olives you placed in my charge. You fetched it and removed it yourself, and now you tell me it contained 1,000 pieces of gold, and that I must restore them to you. Did you ever say anything about them before? Why, I did not even know that the vase had olives in it. You never showed them to me. I wonder that you have not demanded pearls or diamonds. Retire, I pray you, lest a crowd should gather in front of my shop." By this time not only the casual passers-by, but also the neighbouring merchants were standing round, listening to the dispute, and trying every now and then to smooth matters between them. But at the merchant's last words, Ali-Cogia resolved to lay the cause of the quarrel before them, and told them the whole story. They heard him to the end, and inquired of the merchant what he had to say. The accused man admitted that he had kept Ali-Cogia's vase in his shop, but he denied having touched it, and swore that as to what it contained he only knew what Ali-Cogia had told him, and called them all to witness the insult that had been put upon him. "You have brought it on yourself," said Ali-Cogia, taking him by the arm, "and as you appeal to the law you shall have. Let us see if you will dare to repeat your story before the Cadi." Now, as a good Mussulman, the merchant was forbidden to refuse this choice of a judge, so he accepted the test, and said to Ali-Cogia, "Very well. I should like nothing better, and we shall soon see which of us is in the right." So the two men presented themselves before the Cadi, and Ali-Cogia again repeated his tale. The Cadi asked what witnesses he had. Ali-Cogia replied that he had not taken this precaution, as he had considered the man his friend, and up to this time had always found him honest. The merchant, on his side, stuck to his story, and offered to swear solemnly that not only had he never stolen the 1,000 gold pieces, but that he did not even know they were there. The Cadi allowed him to take the oath, and pronounced him innocent. Ali-Cogia, furious at having to suffer such a loss, protested against the verdict, declaring that he would appeal to the Caliph, Haroun-al-Raschid himself. But the Cadi paid no attention to his threats, and was quite satisfied that he had done what was right. Judgment being given, the merchant returned home triumphant, and Ali-Cogia went back to his inn to draw up a petition to the Caliph. The next morning he placed himself on the road along which the Caliph must pass after midday prayer, and stretched out his petition to the officer who walked before the Caliph, whose duty it was to collect such things, and on entering the palace to hand them to his master. There Haroun-al-Raschid studied them carefully. Knowing this custom, Ali-Cogia followed the Caliph into the public hall of the palace, and waited the result. After some time the officer appeared, and told him that the Caliph had read his petition, and had appointed an hour the next morning to give him audience. He then inquired the merchant's address, so that he might be summoned to attend also. That very evening the Caliph, with his Grand Vizier Giafar, and Mesrour, chief of the eunuchs, all three disguised, as was their habit, went out to take a stroll through the town. Going down one street, the Caliph's attention was attracted by a noise, and looking through a door which opened into a court, he perceived 10 or 12 children playing in the moonlight. He hid himself in a dark corner and watched them. "Let us play at being the Cadi," said the brightest and quickest of them all. "I will be the Cadi. Bring before me Ali-Cogia and the merchant who robbed him of the 1,000 pieces of gold." The boy's words recalled to the Caliph the petition that he had read that morning, and he waited with interest to see what the children would do. The proposal was hailed with joy by the other children, who had heard a great deal of talk about the matter, and they quickly settled the part each one was to play. The Cadi took his seat gravely, and an officer introduced first Ali-Cogia, the plaintiff, and then the merchant who was the defendant. Ali-Cogia made a low bow, and pleaded his cause point by point, concluding by imploring the Cadi not to inflict on him such a heavy loss. The Cadi, having heard his case, turned to the merchant, and inquired why he had not repaid Ali-Cogia the sum in question. The false merchant repeated the reasons that the real merchant had given to the Cadi of Bagdad, and also offered to swear that he told the truth. "Stop a moment," said the little Cadi. "Before we come to oaths, I should like to examine the vase with the olives. Ali-Cogia," he added, "have you got the vase with you?" And finding he had not, the Cadi continued, "Go and get it, and bring it to me." So Ali-Cogia disappeared for an instant, and then pretended to lay a vase at the feet of the Cadi, declaring it was his vase which he had given to the accused for safe custody. And in order to be quite correct, the Cadi asked the merchant if he recognized it as the same vase. By his silence the merchant admitted the fact, and the Cadi then commanded to have the vase opened. Ali-Cogia made a movement as if he was taking off the lid, and the little Cadi on his part made a pretense of peering into the vase. "What beautiful olives," he said. "I should like to taste one," and pretended to put one in his mouth. He added, "They are really excellent." "But," he went on, "it seems to me odd that olives 7 years old should be as good as that. Send for some dealers in olives and let us hear what they say." 2 children were presented to him as olive merchants, and the Cadi addressed them. "Tell me, how long can olives be kept so as to be pleasant eating?" "My lord," replied the merchants, "however much care is taken to preserve them, they never last beyond the 3rd year. They lose both taste and color, and are only fit to be thrown away." "If it is so," answered the little Cadi, "examine this vase and tell me how long the olives have been in it." The olive merchants pretended to examine the olives and taste them, then reported to the Cadi that they were fresh and good. "You are mistaken," said he. "Ali-Cogia declares he put them in that vase 7 years ago." "My lord," returned the olive merchants, "we can assure you that the olives are those of the present year, and if you consult all the merchants in Bagdad you will not find one to give a contrary opinion." The accused merchant opened his mouth as if to protest, but the Cadi gave him no time. "Be silent," he said. "You are a thief. Take him away and hang him." So the game ended, the children clapping their hands in applause and leading the criminal away to be hanged. Haroun-al-Raschid was lost in astonishment at the wisdom of the child, who had given so wise a verdict on the case that he himself was to hear on the morrow. "Is there any other verdict possible?" he asked the Grand Vizir, who was as much impressed as himself. "I can imagine no better judgment." "If the circumstances are really such as we have heard," replied the Grand Vizir, "it seems to me your Highness could only follow the example of this boy, in the method of reasoning and also in your conclusions." "Then take careful note of this house," said the Caliph, "and bring me the boy tomorrow, so that the affair may be tried by him in my presence. Summon also the Cadi to learn his duty from the mouth of a child. Bid Ali-Cogia bring his vase of olives, and see that 2 dealers in olives are present." So saying, the Caliph returned to the palace. The next morning early, the Grand Vizir went back to the house where they had seen the children playing, and asked for the mistress and her children. 3 boys appeared, and the Grand Vizir inquired which had represented the Cadi in their game the previous evening. The eldest and tallest, changing colour, confessed that it was he, and to his mother's great alarm, the Grand Vizir said that he had strict orders to bring him into the presence of the Caliph. "Does he want to take my son from me?" cried the poor woman, but the Grand Vizir hastened to calm her, by assuring her that she would have the boy again in an hour, and she would be quite satisfied when she knew the reason of the summons. So she dressed the boy in his best clothes, and the 2 left the house. When the Grand Vizir presented the child to the Caliph, he was a little awed and confused, and the Caliph proceeded to explain why he had sent for him. "Approach, my son," he said kindly. "I think it was you who judged the case of Ali-Cogia and the merchant last night. I overheard you by chance, and was very pleased with the way you conducted it. Today you will see the real Ali-Cogia and the real merchant. Seat yourself at once next to me." The Caliph being seated on his throne with the boy next to him, the parties to the suit were ushered in. One by one they prostrated themselves, and touched the carpet at the foot of the throne with their foreheads. When they rose up, the Caliph said, "Now speak. This child will give you justice, and if more should be wanted I will see to it myself." Ali-Cogia and the merchant pleaded one after another, but when the merchant offered to swear the same oath that he had taken before the Cadi, he was stopped by the child, who said that before this was done he must first see the vase of olives. At these words, Ali-Cogia presented the vase to the Caliph, and uncovered it. The Caliph took one of the olives, tasted it, and ordered the expert merchants to do the same. They pronounced the olives good and fresh that year. The boy informed them that Ali-Cogia declared it was 7 years since he placed them in the vase, to which they returned the same answer as the children had done. The accused merchant saw by this time that his condemnation was certain, and tried to allege something in his defence. The boy had too much sense to order him to be hanged, and looked at the Caliph, saying, "Commander of the faithful, this is not a game now. It is for your Highness to condemn him to death, not for me." Then the Caliph, convinced that the man was a thief, bade them take him away and hang him, which was done, but not before he had confessed his guilt, and the place in which he had hidden Ali-Colia's money. The Caliph ordered the Cadi to learn how to deal justice from the mouth of a child, and sent the boy home, with a purse containing 100 pieces of gold as a mark of his favour. End of chapter 35.
Chapter 36 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 36. The Enchanted Horse, Part 1. It was the feast of the New Year, the oldest and most splendid of all the feasts in the kingdom of Persia, and the day had been spent by the king in the city of Shiraz, taking part in the magnificent spectacles prepared by his subjects to do honour to the festival. The sun was setting, and the monarch was about to give his court the signal to retire, when suddenly an Indian appeared before his throne, leading a horse richly harnessed, and looking in every respect exactly like a real one. "Sire," said he, prostrating himself as he spoke, "although I make my appearance so late before your highness, I can confidently assure you that none of the wonders you have seen during the day can be compared to this horse, if you will deign to cast your eyes upon him." "I see nothing in it," replied the king, "except a clever imitation of a real one, and any skilled workman might do as much." "Sire," returned the Indian, "it is not of his outward form that I would speak, but of the use that I can make of him. I have only to mount him, and to wish myself in some special place, and no matter how distant it may be, in a very few moments I shall find myself there. It is this, sire, that makes the horse so marvellous, and if your highness will allow me, you can prove it for yourself." The king of Persia, who was interested in everything out of the common, and had never before come across a horse with such qualities, bade the Indian mount the animal, and show what he could do. In an instant the man had vaulted on his back, and inquired where the monarch wished to send him. "Do you see that mountain?" asked the king, pointing to a huge mass that towered into the sky about 3 leagues from Shiraz. "Go and bring me the leaf of a palm that grows at the foot." The words were hardly out of the king's mouth when the Indian turned a screw placed in the horse's neck, close to the saddle, and the animal bounded like lightning up into the air, and was soon beyond the sight even of the sharpest eyes. In a quarter of an hour the Indian was seen returning, bearing in his hand the palm, and guiding his horse to the foot of the throne, he dismounted, and laid the leaf before the king. Now the monarch had no sooner proved the astonishing speed of which the horse was capable, than he longed to possess it himself. And indeed, so sure was he that the Indian would be quite ready to sell it, that he looked upon it as his own already. "I never guessed from his mere outside how valuable an animal he was," he remarked to the Indian, "and I am grateful to you for having shown me my error," said he. "If you will sell it, name your own price." "Sire," replied the Indian, "I never doubted that a sovereign so wise and accomplished as your highness would do justice to my horse, when he once knew its power, and I even went so far as to think it probable that you might wish to possess it. Greatly as I prize it, I will yield it up to your highness on one condition. The horse was not constructed by me, but was given me by the inventor, in exchange for my only daughter, who made me take a solemn oath that I would never part with it, except for some object of equal value." "Name anything you like," cried the monarch, interrupting him. "My kingdom is large, and filled with fair cities. You have only to choose which you would prefer, to become its ruler to the end of your life." "Sire," answered the Indian, to whom the proposal did not seem nearly so generous as it appeared to the king, "I am most grateful to your highness for your princely offer, and beseech you not to be offended with me if I say that I can only deliver up my horse in exchange for the hand of the princess your daughter." A shout of laughter burst from the courtiers as they heard these words, and Prince Firouz Schah, the heir apparent, was filled with anger at the Indian's presumption. The king, however, thought that it would not cost him much to part with the princess in order to gain such a delightful toy. And while he was hesitating as to his answer, the prince broke in. "Sire," he said, "It is not possible that you can doubt for an instant what reply you should give to such an insolent bargain. Consider what you owe to yourself, and to the blood of your ancestors." "My son," replied the king, "you speak nobly, but you do not realize either the value of the horse, or the fact that if I reject the proposal of the Indian, he will only make the same to some other monarch, and I should be filled with despair at the thought that anyone but myself should own this seventh wonder of the world. Of course I do not say that I shall accept his conditions, and perhaps he may be brought to reason. But meanwhile I should like you to examine the horse, and with the owner's permission, to make trial of its powers." The Indian, who had overheard the king's speech, thought that he saw in it signs of yielding to his proposal, so he joyfully agreed to the monarch's wishes, and came forward to help the prince to mount the horse, and show him how to guide it. But before he had finished, the young man turned the screw, and was soon out of sight. They waited some time, expecting that every moment he might be seen returning in the distance, but at length the Indian grew frightened, and prostrating himself before the throne, he said to the king, "Sire, your highness must have noticed that the prince, in his impatience, did not allow me to tell him what it was necessary to do in order to return to the place from which he started. I implore you not to punish me for what was not my fault, and not to visit on me any misfortune that may occur." "But why?" cried the king in a burst of fear and anger. "Why did you not call him back when you saw him disappearing?" "Sire," replied the Indian, "the rapidity of his movements took me so by surprise that he was out of hearing before I recovered my speech. But we must hope that he will perceive and turn a second screw, which will have the effect of bringing the horse back to earth." "But supposing he does?" answered the king. "What is to hinder the horse from descending straight into the sea, or dashing him to pieces on the rocks?" "Have no fears, your highness," said the Indian. "The horse has the gift of passing over seas, and of carrying his rider wherever he wishes to go." "Well, your head shall answer for it," returned the monarch, "and if in 3 months he is not safe back with me, or at any rate does not send me news of his safety, your life shall pay the penalty." So saying, he ordered his guards to seize the Indian and throw him into prison. Meanwhile, Prince Firouz Schah had gone gaily up into the air, and for the space of an hour continued to ascend higher and higher, till the very mountains were not distinguishable from the plains. Then he began to think it was time to come down, and took for granted that, in order to do this, it was only needful to turn the screw the reverse way, but to his surprise and horror he found that, turn as he might, he did not make the smallest impression. He then remembered that he had never waited to ask how he was to get back to earth again, and understood the danger in which he stood. Luckily he did not lose his head, and set about examining the horse's neck with great care, till at last, to his intense joy, he discovered a tiny little peg, much smaller than the other, close to the right ear. This he turned, and found himself dropping to the earth, though more slowly than he had left it. It was now dark, and as the prince could see nothing, he was obliged, not without some feeling of disquiet, to allow the horse to direct his own course, and midnight was already past before Prince Firouz Schah again touched the ground, faint and weary from his long ride, and from the fact that he had eaten nothing since early morning. The first thing he did on dismounting was to try to find out where he was, and, as far as he could discover in the thick darkness, he found himself on the terraced roof of a huge palace, with a balustrade of marble running round. In one corner of the terrace stood a small door, opening on to a staircase which led down into the palace. Some people might have hesitated before exploring further, but not so the prince. "I am doing no harm," he said, "and whoever the owner may be, he will not touch me when he sees I am unarmed." And in dread of making a false step, he went cautiously down the staircase. On a landing he noticed an open door, beyond which was a faintly lighted hall. Before entering, the prince paused and listened, but he heard nothing except the sound of men snoring. By the light of a lantern, suspended from the roof, he perceived a row of black guards sleeping, each with a naked sword lying by him, and he understood that the hall must form the ante-room to the chamber of some queen or princess. Standing quite still, Prince Firouz Schah looked about him till his eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, and he noticed a bright light shining through a curtain in one corner. He then made his way softly towards it, and drawing aside its folds, passed into a magnificent chamber full of sleeping women, all lying on low couches, except one, who was on a sofa, and this one he knew must be the princess. Gently stealing up to the side of her bed, he looked at her, and saw that she was more beautiful than any woman he had ever beheld. But fascinated though he was well aware of the danger of his position, as one cry of surprise would awake the guards, and cause his certain death. So sinking quietly on his knees, he took hold of the sleeve of the princess and drew her arm lightly towards him. The princess opened her eyes, and seeing before her a handsome well-dressed man, she remained speechless with astonishment. This favourable moment was seized by the prince, who, bowing low while he knelt, thus addressed her: "You behold, madam, a prince in distress, son to the king of Persia, who, owing to an adventure so strange that you will scarcely believe it, finds himself here, a suppliant for your protection. But yesterday I was in my father's court, engaged in the celebration of our most solemn festival. Today I am in an unknown land, in danger of my life." Now the princess whose mercy Prince Firouz Schah implored was the eldest daughter of the king of Bengal, who was enjoying rest and change in the palace her father had built her, at a little distance from the capital. She listened kindly to what he had to say, and then answered: "Prince, be not uneasy. Hospitality and humanity are practised as widely in Bengal as they are in Persia. The protection you ask will be given you by all. You have my word for it." And as the prince was about to thank her for her goodness, she added quickly: "However great may be my curiosity to learn by what means you have travelled here so speedily, I know that you must be faint for want of food, so I shall give orders to my women to take you to one of my chambers, where you will be provided with supper, and left to repose." By this time the princess's attendants were all awake, and listening to the conversation. At a sign from their mistress they rose, dressed themselves hastily, and snatching up some of the tapers which lighted the room, conducted the prince to a large and lofty room, where two of the number prepared his bed, and the rest went down to the kitchen, from which they soon returned with all sorts of dishes. Then, showing him cupboards filled with dresses and linen, they quitted the room. During their absence the Princess of Bengal, who had been greatly struck by the beauty of the prince, tried in vain to go to sleep again. It was of no use. She felt broad awake, and when her women entered the room, she inquired eagerly if the prince had all he wanted, and what they thought of him. "Madame," they replied, "it is of course impossible for us to tell what impression this young man has made on you. For ourselves, we think you would be fortunate if the king your father should allow you to marry anyone so amiable. Certainly there is no one in the court of Bengal who can be compared with him." These flattering observations were by no means displeasing to the princess, but as she did not wish to betray her own feelings, she merely said: "You are all a set of chatterboxes. Go back to bed, and let me sleep." When she dressed the following morning, her maids noticed that, contrary to her usual habit, the princess was very particular about her toilette, and insisted on her hair being dressed 2 or 3 times over. "For," she said to herself, "if my appearance was not displeasing to the prince when he saw me in the condition I was, how much more will he be struck with me when he beholds me with all my charms?" Then she placed in her hair the largest and most brilliant diamonds she could find, with a necklace, bracelets, and girdle, all of precious stones, and over her shoulders her ladies put a robe of the richest stuff in all the Indies, that no one was allowed to wear except members of the royal family. When she was fully dressed according to her wishes, she sent to know if the Prince of Persia was awake and ready to receive her, as she desired to present herself before him. When the princess's messenger entered his room, Prince Firouz Schah was in the act of leaving it, to inquire if he might be allowed to pay his homage to her mistress, but on hearing the princess's wishes, he at once gave way. "Her will is my law," he said. "I am only here to obey her orders." In a few moments the princess herself appeared, and after the usual compliments had passed between them, the princess sat down on a sofa, and began to explain to the prince her reasons for not giving him an audience in her own apartments. "Had I done so," she said, "we might have been interrupted at any hour by the chief of the eunuchs, who has the right to enter whenever it pleases him, whereas this is forbidden ground. I am all impatience to learn the wonderful accident which has procured the pleasure of your arrival, and that is why I have come to you here, where no one can intrude upon us. Begin then, I entreat you, without delay." So the prince began at the beginning, and told all the story of the festival of Nedrouz held yearly in Persia, and of the splendid spectacles celebrated in its honour. But when he came to the enchanted horse, the princess declared that she could never have imagined anything half so surprising. "Well then," continued the prince, "you can easily understand how the king, my father, who has a passion for all curious things, was seized with a violent desire to possess this horse, and asked the Indian what sum he would take for it. The man's answer was absolutely absurd, as you will agree, when I tell you that it was nothing less than the hand of the princess my sister. But though all the bystanders laughed and mocked, and I was beside myself with rage, I saw to my despair that my father could not make up his mind to treat the insolent proposal as it deserved. I tried to argue with him, but in vain. He only begged me to examine the horse with a view, as I quite understood, of making me more sensible of its value. To please my father I mounted the horse, and without waiting for any instructions from the Indian, turned the peg as I had seen him do. In an instant I was soaring upwards, much quicker than an arrow could fly, and I felt as if I must be getting so near the sky that I should soon hit my head against it. I could see nothing beneath me, and for some time was so confused that I did not even know in what direction I was travelling. At last, when it was growing dark, I found another screw, and on turning it, the horse began slowly to sink towards the earth. I was forced to trust to chance, and to see what fate had in store, and it was already past midnight when I found myself on the roof of this palace. I crept down the little staircase and made directly for a light which I perceived through an open door. I peeped cautiously in, and saw, as you will guess, the eunuchs lying asleep on the floor. I knew the risks I ran, but my need was so great that I paid no attention to them, and stole safely past your guards to the curtain which concealed your doorway. The rest, princess, you know, and it only remains for me to thank you for the kindness you have shown me, and to assure you of my gratitude. By the law of nations, I am already your slave, and I have only my heart, that is my own, to offer you. But what am I saying? My own? Alas, madame, it was yours from the first moment I beheld you." The air with which he said these words could have left no doubt on the mind of the princess as to the effect of her charms, and the blush which mounted to her face only increased her beauty. "Prince," returned she as soon as her confusion permitted her to speak, "you have given me the greatest pleasure, and I have followed you closely in all your adventures, and though you are positively sitting before me, I even trembled at your danger in the upper regions of the air. Let me say what a debt I owe to the chance that has led you to my house. You could have entered none which would have given you a warmer welcome. As to your being a slave, of course that is merely a joke, and my reception must itself have assured you that you are as free here as at your father's court. As to your heart," continued she in tones of encouragement, "I am quite sure that must have been disposed of long ago, to some princess who is well worthy of it, and I could not think of being the cause of your unfaithfulness to her." Prince Firouz Schah was about to protest that there was no lady with any prior claims, but he was stopped by the entrance of one of the princess's attendants, who announced that dinner was served, and, after all, neither was sorry for the interruption. Dinner was laid in a magnificent apartment, and the table was covered with delicious fruits, while during the repast richly dressed girls sang softly and sweetly to stringed instruments. After the prince and princess had finished, they passed into a small room hung with blue and gold, looking out into a garden stocked with flowers and arbutus trees, quite different from any that were to be found in Persia. "Princess," observed the young man, "till now I had always believed that Persia could boast finer palaces and more lovely gardens than any kingdom upon earth. But my eyes have been opened, and I begin to perceive that, wherever there is a great king, he will surround himself with buildings worthy of him." "Prince," replied the Princess of Bengal, "I have no idea what a Persia palace is like, so I am unable to make comparisons. I do not wish to depreciate my own palace, but I can assure you that it is very poor beside that of the king my father, as you will agree when you have been there to greet him, as I hope you will shortly do." Now the princess hoped that, by bringing about a meeting between the prince and her father, the king would be so struck with the young man's distinguished air and fine manners that he would offer him his daughter to wife. But the reply of the Prince of Persia to her suggestion was not quite what she wished. "Madam," he said, "by taking advantage of your proposal to visit the palace of the King of Bengal, I should satisfy not merely my curiosity, but also the sentiments of respect with which I regard him. But, Princess, I am persuaded that you will feel with me, that I cannot possibly present myself before so great a sovereign without the attendants suitable to my rank. He would think me an adventurer." "If that is all," she answered, "you can get as many attendants here as you please. There are plenty of Persian merchants, and as for money, my treasury is always open to you. Take what you please." Prince Firouz Schah guessed what prompted so much kindness on the part of the princess, and was much touched by it. Still his passion, which increased every moment, did not make him forget his duty, so he replied without hesitation, "I do not know, Princess, how to express my gratitude for your obliging offer, which I would accept at once if it were not for the recollection of all the uneasiness the king my father must be suffering on my account. I should be unworthy indeed of all the love he showers upon me, if I did not return to him at the first possible moment. For while I am enjoying the society of the most amiable of all princesses, he is, I am quite convinced, plunged in the deepest grief, having lost all hope of seeing me again. I am sure you will understand my position, and will feel that to remain away one instant longer than necessary would not only be ungrateful on my part, but perhaps even a crime, for how do I know if my absence may not break his heart? But," continued the prince, "having obeyed the voice of my conscience, I shall count the moments when, with your gracious permission, I may present myself before the King of Bengal, not as a wanderer, but as a prince, to implore the favour of your hand. My father has always informed me that in my marriage I shall be left quite free, but I am persuaded that I have only to describe your generosity for my wishes to become his own." The Princess of Bengal was too reasonable not to accept the explanation offered by Prince Firouz Schah, but she was much disturbed at his intention of departing at once, for she feared that, no sooner had he left her, than the impression she had made on him would fade away. So she made one more effort to keep him, and after assuring him that she entirely approved of his anxiety to see his father, begged him to give her a day or two more of his company. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 37. The Enchanted Horse. Part 2. In common politeness, the prince could hardly refuse this request, and the princess set about inventing every kind of amusement for him, and succeeded so well that 2 months slipped by almost unnoticed, in balls, spectacles, and in hunting, of which, when unattended by danger, the princess was passionately fond. But at last, one day, he declared seriously that he could neglect his duty no longer, and entreated her to put no further obstacles in his way, promising at the same time to return, as soon as he could, with all the magnificence due both to her and to himself. "Princess," he added, "it may be that in your heart you class me with those false lovers whose devotion cannot stand the test of absence. If you do, you wrong me, and were it not for fear of offending you, I would beseech you to come with me, for my life can only be happy when passed with you. As for your reception at the Persian court, it will be as warm as your merits deserve, and as for what concerns the King of Bengal, he must be much more indifferent to your welfare than you have led me to believe, if he does not give his consent to our marriage." The princess could not find words in which to reply to the arguments of the Prince of Persia, but her silence and her downcast eyes spoke for her, and declared that she had no objection to accompanying him on his travels. The only difficulty that occurred to her was that Prince Firouz Schah did not know how to manage the horse, and she dreaded lest they might find themselves in the same plight as before. But the prince soothed her fears so successfully that she soon had no other thought than to arrange for their flight so secretly that no one in the palace should suspect it. This was done, and early the following morning, when the whole palace was wrapped in sleep, she stole up onto the roof, where the prince was already awaiting her with his horse's head towards Persia. He mounted first, and helped the princess up behind. Then when she was firmly seated, with her hands holding tightly to his belt, he touched the screw, and the horse began to leave the earth quickly behind him. He travelled with his accustomed speed, and Prince Firouz Schah guided him so well that in 2 hours and a half from the time of starting, he saw the capital of Persia lying beneath him. He determined to alight neither in the great square from which he had started, nor in the Sultan's palace, but in a country house at a little distance from the town. Here he showed the princess a beautiful suite of rooms, and begged her to rest, while he informed his father of their arrival, and prepared a public reception worthy of her rank. Then he ordered a horse to be saddled, and set out. All the way through the streets he was welcomed with shouts of joy by the people, who had long lost all hope of seeing him again. On reaching the palace he found the Sultan surrounded by his ministers, all clad in the deepest mourning, and his father almost went out of his mind with surprise and delight at the mere sound of his son's voice. When he had calmed down a little, he begged the prince to relate his adventures. The prince at once seized the opening thus given him, and told the whole story of his treatment by the Princess of Bengal, not even concealing the fact that she had fallen in love with him. "And, sire," ended the prince, "having given my royal word that you would not refuse your consent to our marriage, I persuaded her to return with me on the Indian's horse. I have left her in one of your highness's country houses, where she is waiting anxiously to be assured that I have not promised in vain." As he said this the prince was about to throw himself at the feet of the Sultan, but his father prevented him, and embracing him again, said eagerly, "My son, not only do I gladly consent to your marriage with the Princess of Bengal, but I will hasten to pay my respects to her, and to thank her in my own person for the benefits she has conferred on you. I will then bring her back with me, and make all arrangements for the wedding to be celebrated today." So the Sultan gave orders that the habits of mourning worn by the people should be thrown off, and that there should be a concert of drums, trumpets, and cymbals. Also that the Indian should be taken from prison and brought before him. His commands were obeyed, and the Indian was led into his presence, surrounded by guards. "I have kept you locked up," said the Sultan, "so that in case my son was lost, your life should pay the penalty. He has now returned, so take your horse and be gone for ever." The Indian hastily quitted the presence of the Sultan, and when he was outside he inquired of the man who had taken him out of prison where the prince had really been all this time, and what he had been doing. They told him the whole story, and how the Princess of Bengal was even then awaiting in the country palace the consent of the Sultan, which at once put into the Indian's head a plan of revenge for the treatment he had experienced. Going straight to the country house, he informed the doorkeeper who was left in charge that he had been sent by the Sultan and by the Prince of Persia to fetch the princess on the enchanted horse, and to bring her to the palace. The doorkeeper knew the Indian by sight, and was of course aware that nearly 3 months before he had been thrown into prison by the Sultan, and seeing him at liberty, the man took for granted that he was speaking the truth, and made no difficulty about leading him before the Princess of Bengal, while on her side, hearing that he had come from the prince, the lady gladly consented to do what he wished. The Indian, delighted with the success of his scheme, mounted the horse, assisted the princess to mount behind him, and turned the peg at the very moment that the prince was leaving the palace in Shiraz for the country house, followed closely by the Sultan and all the court. Knowing this, the Indian deliberately steered the horse right above the city, in order that his revenge for his unjust imprisonment might be all the quicker and sweeter. When the Sultan of Persia saw the horse and its riders, he stopped short with astonishment and horror, and broke out into oaths and curse, which the Indian heard quite unmoved, knowing that he was perfectly safe from pursuit. But mortified and furious as the Sultan was, his feelings were nothing to those of Prince Firouz Schah when he saw the object of his passionate devotion being borne rapidly away. And while he was struck speechless with grief and remorse at not having guarded her better, she vanished swiftly out of his sight. What was he to do? Should he follow his father into the palace, and there give reins to his despair? Both his love and his courage alike forbade it, and he continued his way to the palace. The sight of the prince showed the doorkeeper of what folly he had been guilty, and flinging himself at his master's feet, implored his pardon. "Rise," said the prince. "I am the cause of this misfortune, and not you. Go and find me the dress of a dervish, but beware of saying it is for me." At a short distance from the country house, a convent of dervishes was situated, and the superior, or Shia, was the doorkeeper's friend. So by means of a false story made up on the spur of the moment, it was easy enough to get hold of a dervish's dress, which the prince at once put on instead of his own. Disguised like this, and concealing about him a box of pearls and diamonds he had intended as a present to the princess, he left the house at nightfall, uncertain where he should go, but firmly resolved not to return without her. Meanwhile, the Indian had turned the horse in such a direction that, before many hours had passed, it had entered a wood close to the capital of the kingdom of Cashmere. Feeling very hungry, and supposing that the princess also might be in want of food, he brought his steed down to the earth, and left the princess in a shady place, on the banks of a clear stream. At first, when the princess found herself alone, the idea had occurred to her of trying to escape and hide herself, but as she had eaten scarcely anything since she had left Bengal, she felt she was too weak to venture far, and was obliged to abandon her design. On the return of the Indian with meats of various kinds, she began to eat voraciously, and soon had regained sufficient courage to reply with spirit to his insolent remarks. Goaded by his threats, she sprang to her feet, calling loudly for help, and luckily her cries were heard by a troop of horsemen, who rode up to inquire what was the matter. Now the leader of these horsemen was the Sultan of Cashmere, returning from the chase, and he instantly turned to the Indian to inquire who he was and whom he had with him. The Indian rudely answered that it was his wife, and there was no occasion for anyone else to interfere between them. The princess, who of course was ignorant of the rank of her deliverer, denied altogether the Indian's story. "My lord," she cried, "whoever you may be, put no faith in this impostor. He is an abominable magician, who has this day torn me from the Prince of Persia, my destined husband, and has brought me here on this enchanted horse." She would have continued, but her tears choked her, and the Sultan of Cashmere, convinced by her beauty and her distinguished air of the truth of her tale, ordered his followers to cut off the Indian's head, which was done immediately. But rescued though she was from one peril, it seemed as if she had only fallen into another. The Sultan commanded a horse to be given her, and conducted her to his own palace, where he led her to a beautiful apartment, and selected female slaves to wait on her, and eunuchs to be her guard. Then, without allowing her time to thank him for all he had done, he bade her repose, saying she should tell him her adventures on the following day. The princess fell asleep, flattering herself that she had only to relate her story for the Sultan to be touched by compassion, and to restore her to the prince without delay. But a few hours were to undeceive her. When the Prince of Cashmere had quitted her presence the evening before, he had resolved that the sun should not set again without the princess becoming his wife, and at daybreak proclamation of his intention was made throughout the town, by the sound of drums, trumpets, cymbals, and other instruments calculated to fill the heart with joy. The Princess of Bengal was early awakened by the noise, but she did not for one moment imagine that it had anything to do with her, till the Sultan, arriving as soon as she was dressed to inquire after her health, informed her that the trumpet blasts she heard were part of the solemn marriage ceremonies, for which he begged her to prepare. This unexpected announcement caused the princess such terror that she sank down in a dead faint. The slaves that were in waiting ran to her aid, and the Sultan himself did his best to bring her back to consciousness, but for a long while it was all to no purpose. At length her senses began slowly to come back to her, and then, rather than break faith with the Prince of Persia by consenting to such a marriage, she determined to feign madness. So she began by saying all sorts of absurdities, and using all kinds of strange gestures, while the Sultan stood watching her with sorrow and surprise. But as this sudden seizure showed no sign of abating, he left her to her women, ordering them to take the greatest care of her. Still, as the day went on, the malady seemed to become worse, and by night it was almost violent. Days passed in this manner, till at last the Sultan of Cashmere decided to summon all the doctors of his court to consult together over her sad state. Their answer was that madness is of so many different kinds that it was impossible to give an opinion on the case without seeing the princess. So the Sultan gave orders that they were to be introduced into her chamber, one by one, every man according to his rank. This decision had been foreseen by the princess, who knew quite well that if once she allowed the physicians to feel her pulse, the most ignorant of them would discover that she was in perfectly good health, and that her madness was feigned. So as each man approached, she broke out into such violent paroxysms that not one dared to lay a finger on her. A few, who pretended to be cleverer than the rest, declared that they could diagnose sick people only from sight, ordered her certain potions, which she had no difficulty about taking, as she was persuaded they were all harmless. When the Sultan of Cashmere saw that the court doctors could do nothing towards curing the princess, he called in those of the city who fared no better. Then he had recourse to the most celebrated physicians in the other large towns, but finding that the task was beyond their science, he finally sent messengers into the other neighbouring states, with a memorandum containing full particulars of the princess's madness, offering at the same time to pay the expenses of any physician who would come and see for himself, and a handsome reward to the one who should cure her. In answer to this proclamation many foreign professors flocked into Cashmere, but they naturally were not more successful than the rest had been, as the cure depended neither on them nor their skill, but only on the princess herself. It was during this time that Prince Firouz Schah, wandering sadly and hopelessly from place to place, arrived in a large city of India, where he heard a great deal of talk about the Princess of Bengal, who had gone out of her senses, on the very day that she was to have been married to the Sultan of Cashmere. This was quite enough to induce him to take the road to Cashmere, and to inquire at the first inn at which he lodged in the capital the full particulars of the story. When he knew that he had at last found the princess, whom he had so long lost, he set about devising a plan for her rescue. The first thing he did was to procure a doctor's robe, so that his dress, added to the long beard he had allowed to grow on his travels, might unmistakably proclaim his profession. He then lost no time in going to the palace, where he obtained an audience of the chief usher, and while apologizing for his boldness in presuming to think that he could cure the princess where so many others had failed, declared that he had the secret of certain remedies, which had hitherto never failed of their effect. The chief usher assured him that he was heartily welcome, and that the Sultan would receive him with pleasure, and in case of success he would gain a magnificent reward. When the Prince of Persia, in the disguise of a physician, was brought before him, the Sultan wasted no time in talking, beyond remarking that the mere sight of a doctor threw the princess into transports of rage. He then led the prince up to a room under the roof, which had an opening through which he might observe the princess, without himself being seen. The prince looked and beheld the princess reclining on a sofa with tears in her eyes, singing softly to herself a song bewailing her sad destiny, which had deprived her, perhaps for ever, of a being she so tenderly loved. The young man's heart beat fast as he listened, for he needed no further proof that her madness was feigned, and that it was love of him which had caused her to resort to this species of trick. He softly left his hiding place, and returned to the Sultan, to whom he reported that he was sure from certain signs that the princess's malady was not incurable, but that he must see her and speak with her alone. The Sultan made no difficulty in consenting to this, and commanded that he should be ushered into the princess's apartment. The moment she caught sight of his physician's robe, she sprang from her seat in a fury, and heaped insults upon him. The prince took no notice of her behaviour, and approaching quite close, so that his words might be heard by her alone, he said in a low whisper, "Look at me, princess, and you will see that I am no doctor, but the Prince of Persia, who has come to set you free." At the sound of his voice, the Princess of Bengal suddenly grew calm, and an expression of joy overspread her face, such as only comes when what we wish for most and expect the least suddenly happens to us. For some time she was too enchanted to speak, and Prince Firouz Schah took advantage of her silence to explain to her all that had occurred, his despair at watching her disappear before his very eyes, the oath he had sworn to follow her over the world, and his rapture at finally discovering her in the palace of Cashmere. When he finished, he begged in his turn that the princess would tell him how she had come there, so that he might the better devise some means of rescuing her from the tyranny of the Sultan. It needed but a few words from the princess to make him acquainted with the whole situation, and how she had been forced to play the part of a madwoman in order to escape from a marriage with the Sultan, who had not had sufficient politeness even to ask her consent. If necessary, she added, she had resolved to die sooner than permit herself to be forced into such a union, and break faith with a prince whom she loved. The prince then inquired if she knew what had become of the enchanted horse since the Indian's death, but the princess could only reply that she had heard nothing about it. Still she did not suppose that the horse could have been forgotten by the Sultan, after all she had told him of its value. To this the prince agreed, and they consulted together over a plan by which she might be able to make her escape and return with him into Persia. And as the first step she was to dress herself with care, and receive the Sultan with civility when he visited her next morning. The Sultan was transported with delight on learning the result of the interview, and his opinion of the doctor's skill was raised still higher when, on the following day, the princess behaved towards him in such a way as to persuade him that her complete cure would not be long delayed. However, he contented himself with assuring her how happy he was to see her health so much improved, and exhorted her to make every use of so clever a physician, and to repose entire confidence in him. Then he retired without awaiting any reply from the princess. The Prince of Persia left the room at the same time, and asked if he might be allowed humbly to inquire by what means the Princess of Bengal had reached Cashmere, which was so far distant from her father's kingdom, and how she came to be there alone. The Sultan thought the question very natural, and told him the same story that the Princess of Bengal had done, adding that he had ordered the enchanted horse to be taken to his treasury as a curiosity, though he was quite ignorant how it could be used. "Sire," replied the physician, "your Highness's tale has supplied me with the clue I needed to complete the recovery of the princess. During her voyage hither, on an enchanted horse, a portion of its enchantment has by some means been communicated to her person, and it can only be dissipated by certain perfumes of which I possess the secret. If your Highness will deign to consent, and to give the court and the people one of the most astonishing spectacles they have ever witnessed, command the horse to be brought into the big square outside the palace, and leave the rest to me. I promise that in a very few moments, in presence of all the assembled multitude, you shall see the princess as healthy both in mind and body as ever she was in her life. And in order to make the spectacle as impressive as possible, I would suggest that she should be richly dressed and covered with the noblest jewels of the crown." The Sultan readily agreed to all that the prince proposed, and the following morning he desired that the enchanted horse should be taken from the treasury and brought into the great square of the palace. Soon the rumour began to spread through the town that something extraordinary was about to happen, and such a crowd began to collect that the guards had to be called out to keep order, and to make a way for the enchanted horse. When all was ready, the Sultan appeared, and took his place on a platform, surrounded by the chief nobles and officers of his court. When they were seated, the Princess of Bengal was seen leaving the palace, accompanied by the ladies who had been assigned to her by the Sultan. She slowly approached the enchanted horse, and with the help of her ladies she mounted on its back. Directly she was in the saddle, with her feet in the stirrups and the bridle in her hand, the physician placed around the horse some large braziers full of burning coals, into each of which he threw a perfume composed of all sorts of delicious scents. Then he crossed his hands over his breast, and with lowered eyes walked 3 times round the horse, muttering the while certain words. Soon there arose from the burning braziers a thick smoke which almost concealed both the horse and princess, and this was the moment for which he had been waiting. Springing lightly up behind the lady, he leaned forward and turned the peg, and as the horse darted up into the air, he cried aloud so that his words were heard by all present, "Sultan of Cashmere, when you wish to marry princesses who have sought your protection, learn first to gain their consent." It was in this way that the Prince of Persia rescued the Princess of Bengal and returned with her to Persia, where they descended this time before the palace of the king himself. The marriage was only delayed just long enough to make the ceremony as brilliant as possible, and, as soon as the rejoicings were over, an ambassador was sent to the King of Bengal to inform him of what had passed, and to ask his approbation of the alliance between the 2 countries, which he heartily gave. End of chapter 37.
Chapter 38 of The Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale. The Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 38. The story of two sisters who were jealous of their younger sister. Once upon a time there reigned over Persia a sultan named Khosrow, who from his boyhood had been fond of putting on a disguise and seeking adventures in all parts of the city, accompanied by one of his officers disguised like himself. And no sooner was his father buried and the ceremonies over that marked his accession to the throne, than the young man hastened to throw off his robes of state, and calling to his vizier to make ready likewise, stole out in the simple dress of a private citizen into the less known streets of the capital. Passing down a lonely street, the Sultan heard women's voices in loud discussion, and peeping through a crack in the door, he saw three sisters, sitting on a sofa in a large hall, talking in a very lively and earnest manner. Judging from the few words that reached his ear, they were each explaining what sort of men they wished to marry. "I ask nothing better," cried the eldest, "than to have the Sultan's baker for a husband. Think of being able to eat as much as one wanted of that delicious bread that is baked for His Highness alone. Let us see if your wish is as good as mine." "I," replied the second sister, "should be quite content with the Sultan's head cook. What delicate stews I should feast upon! And as I am persuaded that the Sultan's bread is used all through the palace, I should have that into the bargain. You see, my dear sister, my taste is as good as yours." It was now the turn of the youngest sister, who was by far the most beautiful of the three, and had besides more sense than the other two. "As for me," she said, "I should take a higher flight. And if we are to wish for husbands, nothing less than the Sultan himself will do for me." The Sultan was so much amused by the conversation he had overheard that he made up his mind to gratify their wishes, and turning to the Grand Vizier he bade him note the house, and on the following morning to bring the ladies into his presence. The Grand Vizier fulfilled his commission, and hardly giving them time to change their dresses, desired the three sisters to follow him to the palace. Here they were presented one by one. When they had bowed before the Sultan, the sovereign abruptly put the question to them. "Tell me, do you remember what you wished for last night when you were making merry? Fear nothing, but answer me the truth." These words, which were so unexpected, threw the sisters into great confusion. Their eyes fell, and the blushes of the youngest did not fail to make an impression on the heart of the Sultan. All three remained silent, and he hastened to continue. "Do not be afraid. I have not the slightest intention of giving you pain. And let me tell you at once that I know the wishes formed by each one. You," he said, turning to the youngest, "who desired to have me for an husband, shall be satisfied this very day. And you," he added, addressing himself to the other two, "shall be married at the same moment to my baker and to my chief cook." When the Sultan had finished speaking, the three sisters flung themselves at his feet, and the youngest faltered out, "Oh, sire, since you know my foolish words, believe, I pray you, that they were only said in joke. I am unworthy of the honor you propose to do me, and I can only ask pardon for my boldness." The other sisters also tried to excuse themselves, but the Sultan would hear nothing. "No, no," he said, "my mind is made up. Your wishes shall be accomplished." So the three weddings were celebrated that same day, but with a great difference. That of the youngest was marked by all the magnificence that was customary at the marriage of the Shah of Persia, while the festivities attending the nuptials of the Sultan's baker and his chief cook were only such as were suitable to their conditions. This, though quite natural, was highly displeasing to the elder sisters, who fell into a passion of jealousy, which in the end caused a great deal of trouble and pain to several people. And the first time that they had the opportunity of speaking to each other, which was not till several days later at a public bath, they did not attempt to disguise their feelings. "Can you possibly understand what the Sultan saw in that little cat?" said one to the other, "for him to be so fascinated by her?" "He must be quite blind," returned the wife of the chief cook. "As for her looking a little younger than we do, what does that matter? You would have made a far better sultana than she." "Oh, I say nothing of myself," replied the elder, "and if the Sultan had chosen you it would have been all very well, but it really grieves me that he should have selected a wretched little creature like that. However, I will be revenged on her somehow, and I beg you will give me your help in the matter, and to tell me anything that you can think of that is likely to mortify her." In order to carry out their wicked scheme, the two sisters met constantly to talk over their ideas, though all the while they pretended to be as friendly as ever towards the Sultana, who, on her part, invariably treated them with kindness. For a long time no plan occurred to the two plotters that seemed in the least likely to meet with success, but at length the expected birth of an heir gave them the chance for which they had been hoping. They obtained permission of the Sultan to take up their abode in the palace for some weeks, and never left their sister night or day. When at last a little boy, beautiful as the sun, was born, they laid him in his cradle and carried it down to a canal which passed through the grounds of the palace. Then, when leaving it to its fate, they informed the Sultan that instead of the son he had so fondly desired, the Sultana had given birth to a puppy. At this dreadful news, the Sultan was so overcome with rage and grief that it was with great difficulty that the Grand Vizier managed to save the Sultana from his wrath. Meanwhile, the cradle continued to float peacefully along the canal till, on the outskirts of the royal gardens, it was suddenly perceived by the intendant, one of the highest and most respected officials in the kingdom. "Go," he said to a gardener who was working near, "and get that cradle out for me." The gardener did as he was bid, and soon placed the cradle in the hands of the intendant. The official was much astonished to see that the cradle, which he had supposed to be empty, contained a baby, which, young though it was, already gave promise of great beauty. Having no children himself, although he had been married some years, it at once occurred to him that here was a child which he could take and bring up as his own, and bidding the man pick up the cradle and follow him, he turned towards home. "My wife," he exclaimed as he entered the room, "Heaven has denied us any children, but here is one that has been sent in their place. Send for a nurse, and I will do what is needed publicly to recognize it as my son." The wife accepted the baby with joy, and though the intendant saw quite well that it must have come from the royal palace, he did not think it was his business to inquire further into the mystery. The following year another prince was born and sent adrift. But happily for the baby, the intendant of the gardens again was walking by the canal and carried it home as before. The Sultan, naturally enough, was still more furious the second time than the first, but when the same curious accident was repeated in the third year, he could control himself no longer, and to the great joy of the jealous sisters commanded that the Sultana should be executed. But the poor lady was so much beloved at court that not even the dread of sharing her fate could prevent the Grand Vizier and the courtiers from throwing themselves at the Sultan's feet, and imploring him not to inflict so cruel a punishment for what, after all, was not her fault. "Let her live," entreated the Grand Vizier, "and banish her from your presence for the rest of her days. That in itself will be punishment enough." His first passion spent, the Sultan had regained his self-command. "Let her live, then," he said, "since you have it so much at heart. But if I grant her life, it shall only be on one condition, which shall make her daily pray for her death. Let a box be built for her at the door of the principal mosque, and let the window of the box be always open. There she shall sit in the coarsest clothes, and every Mussulman who enters the mosque shall spit in her face in passing. Anyone that refuses to obey shall be exposed to the same punishment himself. You, Vizier, will see that my orders are carried out." The Grand Vizier saw that it was useless to say more, and, full of triumph, the sisters watched the building of the box, and then listened to the jeers of the people at the helpless Sultana sitting inside. But the poor lady bore herself with so much dignity and meekness that it was not long before she had won the sympathy of those that were best among the crowd. But it is now time to return to the fate of the third baby, this time a princess. Like its brothers, it was found by the intendant of the gardens and adopted by him and his wife, and all three were brought up with the greatest care and tenderness. As the children grew older, their beauty and air of distinction became more and more marked, and their manners had all the grace and ease that is proper to people of high birth. The princes had been named by their foster father Bahman and Perviz, after two of the ancient kings of Persia, while the princess was called Parizade, or the child of the genii. The intendant was careful to bring them up as befitted their real rank, and soon appointed a tutor to teach the young princes how to read and write, and the princess, determined not to be left behind, showed herself so anxious to learn with her brothers that the intendant consented to her joining in their lessons, and it was not long before she knew as much as they did. From that time all their studies were done in common. They had the best masters for the fine arts, geography, poetry, history, and science, and even for sciences which are learned by few, and every branch seemed so easy to them that their teachers were astonished at the progress they made. The princess had a passion for music and could sing and play upon all sorts of instruments. She could also ride and drive as well as her brothers, shoot with a bow and arrow, and throw a javelin with the same skill as they, and sometimes even better. In order to set off these accomplishments, the intendant resolved that his foster children should not be pent up any longer in the narrow borders of the palace gardens, where he had always lived. So he bought a splendid country house a few miles from the capital, surrounded by an immense park. This park he filled with wild beasts of various sorts, so that the princes and the princess might hunt as much as they pleased. When everything was ready, the intendant threw himself at the Sultan's feet, and after referring to his age and his long services, begged His Highness's permission to resign his post. This was granted by the Sultan in a few gracious words, and he then inquired what reward he could give his faithful servant. But the intendant declared that he wished for nothing except the continuance of His Highness's favor, and prostrating himself once more, he retired from the Sultan's presence. 5 or 6 months passed away in the pleasures of the country, when death attacked the intendant so suddenly that he had no time to reveal the secret of their birth to his adopted children, and as his wife had long been dead also, it seemed as if the princes and the princess would never know that they had been born to a higher station than the one they filled. Their sorrow for their father was very deep, and they lived quietly on in their new home without feeling any desire to leave it for court gaieties or intrigues. One day the princes, as usual, went out to hunt, but their sister remained alone in her apartments. While they were gone, an old Mussulman devotee appeared at the door and asked leave to enter, as it was the hour of prayer. The princess sent orders at once that the old woman was to be taken to the private oratory in the grounds, and when she had finished her prayers was to be shown the house and gardens, and then to be brought before her. Although the old woman was very pious, she was not at all indifferent to the magnificence of all around her, which she seemed to understand as well as to admire, and when she had seen it all, she was led by the servants before the princess, who was seated in a room which surpassed in splendor all the rest. "My good woman," said the princess, pointing to a sofa, "come and sit beside me. I am delighted at the opportunity of speaking for a few moments with so holy a person." The old woman made some objections to so much honor being done her, but the princess refused to listen, and insisted that her guest should take the best seat, and as she thought she must be tired, ordered refreshments. While the old woman was eating, the princess put several questions to her as to her mode of life and the pious exercises she practiced, and then inquired what she thought of the house now that she had seen it. "Madam," replied the pilgrim, "one must be hard indeed to please to find any fault. It is beautiful, comfortable, and well ordered, and it is impossible to imagine anything more lovely than the garden. But since you ask me, I must confess that it lacks 3 things to make it absolutely perfect." "And what can they be?" cried the princess. "Only tell me, and I will lose no time in getting them." "The 3 things, madam," replied the old woman, "are, first, the talking bird, whose voice draws all other singing birds to it, to join in chorus, and second, the singing tree, where every leaf is a song that is never silent, and lastly, the golden water, of which it is only needful to pour a single drop into a basin, for it to shoot up into a fountain which will never be exhausted, nor will the basin ever overflow." "Oh, how can I thank you," cried the princess, "for telling me of such treasures! But add, I pray you, to your goodness by further informing me where I can find them." "Madam," replied the pilgrim, "I should ill repay the hospitality you have shown me if I refused to answer your question. The three things of which I have spoken are all to be found in one place, on the borders of this kingdom towards India. Your messenger has only to follow the road that passes by your house for 20 days, and at the end of that time he is to ask the first person he meets for the talking bird, the singing tree, and the golden water." She then arose, and bidding farewell to the princess, went her way. The old woman had taken her departure so abruptly that the Princess Parizade did not perceive till she was really gone that the directions were hardly clear enough to enable the search to be successful, and she was still thinking of the subject and how delightful it would be to possess such rarities when the princes, her brothers, returned from the chase. "What is the matter, my sister?" asked Prince Bahman. "Why are you so grave? Are you ill, or has anything happened?" Princess Parizade did not answer directly, but at length she raised her eyes and replied that there was nothing wrong. "But there must be something," persisted Prince Bahman, "for you to have changed so much during the short time we have been absent. Hide nothing from us, I beseech you, unless you wish us to believe that the confidence we have always had in one another is now to cease." "When I said that it was nothing," said the princess, moved by his words, "I meant that it was nothing that affected you, although I admit that it is certainly of some importance to me. Like myself, you have always thought this house that our father built for us was perfect in every respect. But only today I have learned that three things are still lacking to complete it. These are the talking bird, the singing tree, and the golden water." After explaining the peculiar qualities of each, the princess continued, "It was a Mussulman devotee who told me all this, and where they might all be found. Perhaps you will think that the house is beautiful enough as it is, and that we can do quite well without them. But in this I cannot agree with you, and I shall never be content until I have got them. So counsel me, I pray, whom to send on the undertaking." "My dear sister," replied Prince Bahman, "that you should care about the matter is quite enough. Even if we took no interest in it ourselves, we both feel with you, and I claim as the elder the right to make the first attempt, if you will tell me where I am to go and what steps I am to take." Prince Perviz at first objected that being the head of the family, his brother ought not to be allowed to expose himself to danger. But Prince Bahman would hear nothing, and retired to make the needful preparations for his journey. The next morning Prince Bahman got up very early, and after bidding farewell to his brother and sister, mounted his horse. But just as he was about to touch it with his whip, he was stopped by a cry from the princess. "Oh, perhaps after all you may never come back. One never can tell what accidents may happen. Give it up, I implore you, for I would 1,000 times rather lose the talking bird and the singing tree and the golden water than that you should run into danger." "My dear sister," answered the prince, "accidents only happen to unlucky people, and I hope that I am not one of them. But as everything is uncertain, I promise you to be very careful. Take this knife," he continued, handing her one that hung sheathed from his belt, "and every now and then draw it out and look at it. As long as it keeps bright and clean as it is today, you will know that I am living. But if the blade is spotted with blood, it will be a sign that I am dead, and you shall weep for me." So saying, Prince Bahman bade them farewell once more, and started on the high road, well mounted and fully armed. For 20 days he rode straight on, turning neither to the right hand nor to the left, till he found himself drawing near the frontiers of Persia. Seated under a tree by the wayside, he noticed a hideous old man, with a long white moustache and beard that almost fell to his feet. His nails had grown to an enormous length, and on his head he wore a huge hat, which served him for an umbrella. End of Chapter 38. Recording by Dale, Tucson, Arizona. Chapter 39 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale. The Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang. Chapter 39. Prince Bahman, who, remembering the directions of the old woman, had been since sunrise on the lookout for someone, recognized the old man at once to be a dervish. He dismounted from his horse and bowed low before the holy man, saying by way of a greeting, "My father, may your days be long in the land, and may all your wishes be fulfilled." The dervish did his best to reply, but his moustache was so thick that his words were hardly intelligible, and the prince, perceiving what was the matter, took a pair of scissors from his saddle pockets and requested permission to cut off some of the moustache, as he had a question of great importance to ask the dervish. The dervish made a sign that he might do as he liked, and when a few inches of his hair and beard had been pruned all around, the prince assured the holy man that he would hardly believe how much younger he looked. The dervish smiled at his compliments and thanked him for what he had done. "Let me show you my gratitude for making me more comfortable by telling me what I can do for you." "Gentle dervish," replied Prince Bahman, "I come from far, and I seek the talking bird, the singing tree, and the golden water. I know that they are to be found somewhere in these parts, but I am ignorant of the exact spot. Tell me, I pray you, if you can, so that I may not have traveled on a useless quest." While he was speaking, the prince observed a change in the countenance of the dervish, who waited for some time before he made reply. "My lord," he said at last, "I do know the road for which you ask, but your kindness and the friendship I have conceived for you make me loath to point it out." "But why not?" inquired the prince. "What danger can there be?" "The very greatest danger," answered the dervish. "Other men as brave as you have ridden down this road, and have put me that question. I did my best to turn them also from their purpose, but it was of no use. Not one of them would listen to my words, and not one of them came back. Be warned in time and seek to go no further." "I am grateful to you for your interest in me," said Prince Bahman, "and for the advice you have given, though I cannot follow it. But what dangers can there be in the adventure which courage and a good sword cannot meet?" "And suppose," answered the dervish, "that your enemies are invisible. How then?" "Nothing will make me give it up," replied the prince, "and for the last time I ask you to tell me where I am to go." When the dervish saw that the prince's mind was made up, he drew a ball from a bag that lay near him and held it out. "If it must be so," he said with a sigh, "take this, and when you have mounted your horse, throw the ball in front of you. It will roll on till it reaches the foot of a mountain, and when it stops, you will stop also. You will then throw the bridle on your horse's neck without any fear of his straying, and will dismount. On each side you will see vast heaps of big black stones, and will hear a multitude of insulting voices, but pay no heed to them, and above all, beware of ever turning your head. If you do, you will instantly become a black stone like the rest, for those stones are in reality men like yourself, who have been on the same quest and have failed, as I fear that you may fail also. If you manage to avoid this pitfall and to reach the top of the mountain, you will find there the talking bird in a splendid cage, and you can ask of him where you are to seek the singing tree and the golden water. That is all I have to say. You know what you have to do and what to avoid, but if you are wise, you will think of it no more, but return whence you have come." The prince smilingly shook his head, and thanking the dervish once more, he sprang on his horse and threw the ball before him. The ball rolled along the road so fast that Prince Bahman had much difficulty in keeping up with it, and it never relaxed its speed till the foot of the mountain was reached. Then it came to a sudden halt, and the prince at once got down and flung the bridle on his horse's neck. He paused for a moment and looked round him at the masses of black stones with which the sides of the mountain were covered, and then began resolutely to ascend. He had hardly gone 4 steps when he heard the sound of voices around him, although not another creature was in sight. "Who is this imbecile?" cried some. "Stop him at once!" "Kill him!" shrieked others. "Help! Robbers! Murderers! Help! Help!" "Oh, let him alone!" sneered another, and this was the most trying of all. "He is such a beautiful young man, I am sure the bird in the cage must have been kept for him." At first the prince took no heed at all to this clamor, but continued to press forward on his way. Unfortunately, this conduct, instead of silencing the voices, only seemed to irritate them the more, and they arose with redoubled fury in front as well as behind. After some time he grew bewildered, his knees began to tremble, and finding himself in the act of falling, he forgot altogether the advice of the dervish. He turned to fly down the mountain, and in one moment became a black stone. As may be imagined, Prince Perviz and his sister were all this time in the greatest anxiety, and consulted the magic knife not once but many times a day. Hitherto the blade had remained bright and spotless, but on the fatal hour on which Prince Bahman and his horse were changed into black stones, large drops of blood appeared on the surface. "Oh, my beloved brother!" cried the princess in horror, throwing the knife from her. "I shall never see you again, and it is I who have killed you. Fool that I was to listen to the voice of that temptress, who probably was not speaking the truth. What are the talking bird and the singing tree to me in comparison with you, passionately though I long for them?" Prince Perviz's grief at his brother's loss was not less than that of Princess Parizade, but he did not waste his time on useless lamentations. "My sister, why should you think the old woman was deceiving you about these treasures, and what would have been her object in doing so? No, no, our brother must have met his death by some accident or want of precaution, and tomorrow I will start on the same quest." Terrified at the thought that she might lose her only remaining brother, the princess entreated him to give up his project, but he remained firm. Before setting out, however, he gave her a chaplet of 100 pearls, and said, "When I am absent, tell this over daily for me. But if you should find that the beads stick, so that they will not slip one after the other, you will know that my brother's fate has befallen me. Still, we must hope for better luck." Then he departed, and on the 20th day of his journey fell in with the dervish on the same spot as Prince Bahman had met him, and began to question him as to the place where the talking bird, the singing tree, and the golden water were to be found. As in the case of his brother, the dervish tried to make him give up his project, and even told him that only a few weeks since a young man, bearing a strong resemblance to himself, had passed that way but had never come back again. "That holy dervish," replied Prince Perviz, "was my elder brother, who is now dead, though how he died I cannot say." "He is changed into a black stone," answered the dervish, "like all the rest who have gone on the same errand, and you will become one likewise if you are not more careful in following my directions." Then he charged the prince, as he valued his life, to take no heed of the clamor of voices that would pursue him up the mountain, and handing him a ball from the bag, which still seemed to be half full, he sent him on his way. When Prince Perviz reached the foot of the mountain, he jumped from his horse and paused for a moment to recall the instructions the dervish had given him. Then he strode boldly on, but had scarcely gone 5 or 6 paces when he was startled by a man's voice that seemed closer to his ear, exclaiming, "Stop, rash fellow, and let me punish your audacity." This outrage entirely put the dervish's advice out of the prince's head. He drew his sword and turned to avenge himself, but almost before he had realized that there was nobody there, he and his horse were 2 black stones. Not a morning had passed since Prince Perviz had ridden away without Princess Parizade telling her beads, and at night she even hung them round her neck so that if she woke she could assure herself at once of her brother's safety. She was in the very act of moving them through her fingers at the moment that the prince fell a victim to his impatience, and her heart sank when the first pearl remained fixed in its place. However, she had long made up her mind what she would do in such a case, and the following morning the princess, disguised as a man, set out for the mountain. As she had been accustomed to riding from her childhood, she managed to travel as many miles daily as her brothers had done, and it was, as before, on the 20th day that she arrived at the place where the dervish was sitting. "Good dervish," she said politely, "will you allow me to rest by you for a few moments? And perhaps you will be so kind as to tell me if you have ever heard of a talking bird, a singing tree, and some golden water that are to be found somewhere near this." "Madam," replied the dervish, "for in spite of your manly dress, your voice betrays you. I shall be proud to serve you in any way I can, but may I ask the purpose of your question?" "Good dervish," answered the princess, "I have heard such glowing descriptions of these three things that I cannot rest till I possess them." "Madam," said the dervish, "they are far more beautiful than any description, but you seem ignorant of all the difficulties that stand in your way, or you would hardly have undertaken such an adventure. Give it up, I pray you, and return home, and do not ask me to help you to a cruel death." "Holy father," answered the princess, "I come from far, and I should be in despair if I turned back without having attained my object. You have spoken of difficulties. Tell me, I entreat you, what they are, so that I may know if I can overcome them, or see if they are beyond my strength." So the dervish repeated his tale and dwelt more firmly than before on the clamor of the voices, the horrors of the black stones, which were once living men, and the difficulties of climbing the mountain, and pointed out that the chief means of success was never to look behind till you had the cage in your grasp. "As far as I can see," said the princess, "the first thing is not to mind the tumult of the voices that follow you till you reach the cage, and then never to look behind. As to this, I think I have enough self-control to look straight before me. But as it is quite possible that I might be frightened by the voices, as even the boldest men have been, I will stop up my ears with cotton, so that, let them make as much noise as they like, I shall hear nothing." "Madam," cried the dervish, "out of all the number who have asked me the way to the mountain, you are the first who has ever suggested such a means of escaping the danger. It is possible that you may succeed, but all the same the risk is great." "Good dervish," answered the princess, "I feel in my heart that I shall succeed, and it only remains for me to ask you the way I am to go." Then the dervish saw that it would be useless to say more, and he gave her the ball, which she flung before her. The first thing the princess did on arriving at the mountain was to stop her ears with cotton, and then, making up her mind which was the best way to go, she began her ascent. In spite of the cotton, some echoes of the voices reached her ears, but not so as to trouble her. Indeed, though they grew louder and more insulting the higher she climbed, the princess only laughed, and said to herself that she certainly would not let a few rough words stand between her and the goal. At last she perceived in the distance the cage and the bird, whose voice joined itself in tones of thunder to those of the rest. "Return, return! Never dare to come near me!" At the sight of the bird, the princess hastened her steps, and without vexing herself at the noise, which by this time had grown deafening, she walked straight up to the cage, and seizing it, she said, "Now, my bird, I have got you, and I shall take good care that you do not escape." As she spoke, she took the cotton from her ears, for it was needed no longer. "Brave lady," answered the bird, "do not blame me for having joined my voice to those who did their best to preserve my freedom. Although confined in a cage, I was content with my lot. But if I must become a slave, I could not wish for a nobler mistress than one who has shown so much constancy, and from this moment I swear to serve you faithfully. Some day you will put me to the proof, for I know who you are better than you do yourself. Meanwhile, tell me what I can do, and I will obey you." "Bird," replied the princess, who was filled with a joy that seemed strange to herself when she thought that the bird had cost her the lives of both her brothers, "Bird, let me first thank you for your good will, and then let me ask you where the golden water is to be found." The bird described the place, which was not far distant, and the princess filled a small silver flask that she had brought with her for the purpose. She then returned to the cage and said, "Bird, there is still something else. Where shall I find the singing tree?" "Behind you, in that wood," replied the bird, and the princess wandered through the wood till a sound of the sweetest voices told her she had found what she sought. But the tree was tall and strong, and it was hopeless to think of uprooting it. "You need not do that," said the bird, when she had returned to ask counsel. "Break off a twig and plant it in your garden, and it will take root and grow into a magnificent tree." When the Princess Parizade held in her hands the 3 wonders promised her by the old woman, she said to the bird, "All that is not enough. It was owing to you that my brothers became black stones. I cannot tell them from the mass of others, but you must know, and point them out to me, I beg you, for I wish to carry them away." For some reason that the princess could not guess, these words seemed to displease the bird, and he did not answer. The princess waited a moment, and then continued in severe tones, "Have you forgotten that you yourself said that you are my slave to do my bidding, and also that your life is in my power?" "No, I have not forgotten," replied the bird, "but what you ask is very difficult. However, I will do my best. If you look around," he went on, "you will see a pitcher standing near. Take it, and as you go down the mountain, scatter a little of the water it contains over every black stone, and you will soon find your 2 brothers." Princess Parizade took the pitcher, and carrying with her besides the cage, the twig, and the flask, returned down the mountainside. At every black stone she stopped and sprinkled it with water, and as the water touched it, the stone instantly became a man. When she suddenly saw her brothers before her, her delight was mixed with astonishment. "Why, what are you doing here?" she cried. "We have been asleep," they said. "Yes," returned the princess, "but without me your sleep would probably have lasted till the day of judgment. Have you forgotten that you came here in search of the talking bird, the singing tree, and the golden water, and the black stones that were heaped up along the road? Look round and see if there is one left. These gentlemen, and yourselves, and all your horses were changed into these stones, and I have delivered you by sprinkling you with water from this pitcher. As I could not return home without you, even though I had gained the prizes on which I had set my heart, I forced the talking bird to tell me how to break the spell." On hearing these words, Prince Bahman and Prince Perviz understood all they owed their sister, and the knights who stood by declared themselves her slaves, and ready to carry out her wishes. But the princess, while thanking them for their politeness, explained that she wished for no company but that of her brothers, and that the rest were free to go where they should. So saying, the princess mounted her horse, and declining to allow even Prince Bahman to carry the cage with the talking bird, she entrusted him with the branch of the singing tree, while Prince Perviz took care of the flask containing the golden water. Then they rode away, followed by the knights and gentlemen, who begged to be permitted to escort them. It had been the intention of the party to stop and tell their adventures to the dervish, but they found to their sorrow that he was dead, whether from old age or whether from the feeling that his task was done, they never knew. As they continued their road, their numbers grew daily smaller, for the knights turned off one by one to their own homes, and only the brothers and sister finally drew up at the gate of the palace. The princess carried the cage straight into the garden, and as soon as the bird began to sing, nightingales, larks, thrushes, finches, and all sorts of other birds mingled their voices in chorus. The branch she planted in a corner near the house, and in a few days it had grown into a great tree. As for the golden water, it was poured into a great marble basin specially prepared for it, and it swelled and bubbled and then shot up into the air in a fountain 20 feet high. The fame of these wonders soon spread abroad, and people came from far and near to see and admire. After a few days, Prince Bahman and Prince Perviz fell back into their ordinary way of life, and passed most of their time hunting. One day it happened that the Sultan of Persia was also hunting in the same direction, and not wishing to interfere with his sport, the young men, on hearing the noise of the hunt approaching, prepared to retire. But, as luck would have it, they turned into the very path down which the Sultan was coming. They threw themselves from their horses and prostrated themselves to the earth, but the Sultan was curious to see their faces, and commanded them to rise. End of Chapter 39. Recording by Dale, Tucson, Arizona. Chapter 40 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale. The Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang, Chapter 40. The princes stood up respectfully but quite at their ease, and the Sultan looked at them for a few moments without speaking. Then he asked who they were and where they lived. "Sire," replied Prince Bahman, "we are sons of your Highness's late Intendant of the Gardens, and we live in a house that he built a short time before his death, waiting till an occasion should offer itself to serve your Highness." "You seem fond of hunting," answered the Sultan. "Sire," replied Prince Bahman, "it is our usual exercise, and one that should be neglected by no man who expects to comply with the ancient customs of the kingdom and bear arms." The Sultan was delighted with this remark, and said at once, "In that case, I shall take great pleasure in watching you. Come, choose what sort of beasts you would like to hunt." The princes jumped on their horses and followed the Sultan at a little distance. They had not gone very far before they saw a number of wild animals appear at once, and Prince Bahman started to give chase to a lion, and Prince Perviz to a bear. Both used their javelins with such skill that directly they arrived within striking range, the lion and the bear fell, pierced through and through. Then Prince Perviz pursued a lion, and Prince Bahman a bear, and in a very few minutes they too lay dead. As they were making ready for a third assault, the Sultan interfered, and sending one of his officials to summon them, he said, smiling, "If I let you go on, there will soon be no beasts left to hunt. Besides, your courage and manners have so won my heart that I will not have you expose yourselves to further danger. I am convinced that some day or other I shall find you useful as well as agreeable." He then gave them a warm invitation to stay with him altogether, but with many thanks for the honor done them, they begged to be excused and to be suffered to remain at home. The Sultan, who was not accustomed to see his offers rejected, inquired their reasons, and Prince Bahman explained that they did not wish to leave their sister, and were accustomed to do nothing without consulting all three together. "Ask her advice, then," replied the Sultan, "and tomorrow come and hunt with me and give me your answer." The two princes returned home, but their adventure made so little impression on them that they quite forgot to speak to their sister on the subject. The next morning, when they went to hunt, they met the Sultan in the same place, and he inquired what advice their sister had given. The young men looked at each other and blushed. At last Prince Bahman said, "Sire, we must throw ourselves on your Highness's mercy. Neither my brother nor myself remembered anything about it." "Then be sure you do not forget today," answered the Sultan, "and bring me back your reply tomorrow." When, however, the same thing happened a second time, they feared that the Sultan might be angry with them for their carelessness. But he took it in good part, and drawing 3 little golden balls from his purse, he held them out to Prince Bahman, saying, "Put these in your bosom, and you will not forget a third time. For when you remove your girdle tonight, the noise they will make in falling will remind you of my wishes." It all happened as the Sultan had foreseen, and the two brothers appeared in their sister's apartments just as she was in the act of stepping into bed, and told their tale. The Princess Parizade was much disturbed at the news, and did not conceal her feelings. "Your meeting with the Sultan is very honorable to you, and will, I dare say, be of service to you, but it places me in a very awkward position. It is on my account, I know, that you have resisted the Sultan's wishes, and I am very grateful to you for it. But kings do not like to have their offers refused, and in time he would bear a grudge against you, which would render me very unhappy. Consult the talking bird, who is wise and far-seeing, and let me hear what he says." So the bird was sent for, and the case laid before him. "The princes must on no account refuse the Sultan's proposal," said he, "and they must even invite him to come and see your Haroun." "But, bird," objected the princess, "you know how dearly we love each other. Will not all this spoil our friendship?" "Not at all," replied the bird. "It will make it all the closer." "Then the Sultan will have to see me," said the princess. The bird answered that it was necessary that he should see her, and everything would turn out for the best. The following morning, when the Sultan inquired if they had spoken to their sister, and what advice she had given them, Prince Bahman replied that they were ready to agree to his Highness's wishes, and that their sister had reproved them for their hesitation about the matter. The Sultan received their excuses with great kindness, and told them that he was sure they would be equally faithful to him, and kept them by his side for the rest of the day, to the vexation of the Grand Vizier and the rest of the court. When the procession entered in this order the gates of the capital, the eyes of the people who crowded the streets were fixed on the two young men, strangers to everyone. "Oh, if only the Sultan had sons like that!" they murmured. "They look so distinguished and are about the same age that his sons would have been." The Sultan commanded that splendid apartments should be prepared for the two brothers, and even insisted that they should sit at table with him. During dinner he led the conversation to various scientific subjects, and also to history, of which he was especially fond, but whatever topic they might be discussing, he found that the views of the young men were always worth listening to. "If they were my own sons," he said to himself, "they could not be better educated." And aloud he complimented them on their learning and taste for knowledge. At the end of the evening the princes once more prostrated themselves before the throne, and asked leave to return home. And then, encouraged by the gracious words of farewell uttered by the Sultan, Prince Bahman said, "Sire, may we dare to take the liberty of asking whether you would do us and our sister the honor of resting for a few minutes at our house, the first time the hunt passes that way?" "With the utmost pleasure," replied the Sultan, "and as I am all impatience to see the sister of such accomplished young men, you may expect me the day after tomorrow." The princess was of course most anxious to entertain the Sultan in a fitting way, but as she had no experience in court customs, she ran to the talking bird, and begged he would advise her as to what dishes should be served. "My dear mistress," replied the bird, "your cooks are very good, and you can safely leave all to them, except that you must be careful to have a dish of cucumbers stuffed with pearl sauce served with the first course." "Cucumbers stuffed with pearls!" exclaimed the princess. "Why, bird, who ever heard of such a dish? The Sultan will expect a dinner he can eat, not one that he can only admire. Besides, if I were to use all the pearls I possess, they would not half be enough." "Mistress," replied the bird, "and do what I tell you, and nothing but good will come of it. And as to the pearls, if you go at dawn tomorrow and dig at the foot of the first tree in the park, on the right hand, you will find as many as you want." The princess had faith in the bird, who generally proved to be right, and taking the gardener with her early next morning, followed out his directions carefully. After digging for some time, they came upon a golden box, fastened with little clasps. These were easily undone, and the box was found to be full of pearls, not very large ones, but well shaped and of good color. So, leaving the gardener to fill up the hole he had made under the tree, the princess took up the box and returned to the house. The two princes had seen her go out, and had wondered what could have made her rise so early. Full of curiosity, they got up and dressed, and met their sister as she was returning with the box under her arm. "What have you been doing?" they asked, "and did the gardener come to tell you he had found a treasure?" "On the contrary," replied the princess, "it is I who have found one." And opening the box, she showed her astonished brothers the pearls inside. Then, on the way back to the palace, she told them of her consultation with the bird, and the advice it had given her. All three tried to guess the meaning of the singular counsel, but they were forced at last to admit the explanation was beyond them, and they must be content blindly to obey. The first thing the princess did on entering the palace was to send for the head cook, and to order the repast for the Sultan. When she had finished, she suddenly added, "Besides the dishes I have mentioned, there is one that you must prepare expressly for the Sultan, and that no one must touch but yourself. It consists of a stuffed cucumber, and the stuffing is to be made of these pearls." The head cook, who had never in all his experience heard of such a dish, stepped back in amazement. "You think I am mad," answered the princess, who perceived what was in his mind, "but I know quite well what I am doing. Go and do your best, and take the pearls with you." The next morning the princes started for the forest, and were soon joined by the Sultan. The hunt began and continued till midday, when the heat became so great that they were obliged to leave off. Then, as arranged, they turned their horses' heads toward the palace, and while Prince Bahman remained by the side of the Sultan, Prince Perviz rode on to warn his sister of their approach. The moment His Highness entered the courtyard, the princess flung herself at his feet, but he bent and raised her, and gazed at her for some time, struck with her grace and beauty, and also with the indefinable air of courts that seemed to hang around this country girl. "They are all worthy one of the other," he said to himself, "and I am not surprised that they think so much of her opinions. I must know more of them." By this time the princess had recovered from the first embarrassment of meeting, and proceeded to make her speech of welcome. "This is only a simple country house, sire, suitable to people like ourselves who live a quiet life. It cannot compare with the great city mansions, much less, of course, with the smallest of the Sultan's palaces." "I cannot quite agree with you," he replied. "Even the little that I have seen I admire greatly, and I will reserve my judgment until you have shown me the whole." The princess then led the way from room to room, and the Sultan examined everything carefully. "Do you call this a simple country house?" he said at last. "Why, if every country house was like this, the towns would soon be deserted. I am no longer astonished that you do not wish to leave it. Let us go into the gardens, which I am sure are no less beautiful than the rooms." A small door opened straight into the garden, and the first object that met the Sultan's eyes was the golden water. "What lovely colored water!" he exclaimed. "Where is the spring, and how do you make the fountain rise so high? I do not believe there is anything like it in the world." He went forward to examine it, and when he had satisfied his curiosity, the princess conducted him towards the singing tree. As they drew near, the Sultan was startled by the sound of strange voices, but could see nothing. "Where have you hidden your musicians?" he asked the princess. "Are they up in the air or under the earth? Surely the owners of such charming voices ought not to conceal themselves." "Sire," answered the princess, "the voices all come from the tree which is straight in front of us, and if you will deign to advance a few steps, you will see that they become clearer." The Sultan did as he was told, and was so wrapped in delight at what he heard that he stood some time in silence. "Tell me, madam, I pray you," he said at last, "how this marvelous tree came into your garden. It must have been brought from a great distance, or else, fond as I am of all curiosities, I could not have missed hearing of it. What is its name?" "The only name it has, sire," replied she, "is the singing tree, and it is not a native of this country. Its history is mixed up with those of the golden water and the talking bird, which you have not yet seen. If your highness wishes, I will tell you the whole story when you have recovered from your fatigue." "Indeed, madam," returned he, "you show me so many wonders that it is impossible to feel any fatigue. Let us go at once more and look at the golden water, and I am dying to see the talking bird." The Sultan could hardly tear himself away from the golden water, which puzzled him more and more. "You say," he observed the princess, "that this water does not come from any spring, neither is brought by pipes. All I understand is that neither it nor the singing tree is a native of this country." "It is as you say, sire," answered the princess, "and if you examine the basin, you will see that it is all in one piece, and therefore the water could not have been brought through it. What is more astonishing is, that I only emptied a small flaskful into the basin, and it increased to the quantity you see now." "Well, I will look at it no more today. Take me to the talking bird." On approaching the house, the Sultan noticed a vast quantity of birds, whose voices filled the air, and he inquired why they were so much more numerous here than in any other part of the garden. "Sire," answered the princes, "do you see that cage hanging in one of the windows of the saloon? That is the talking bird, whose voice you can hear above them all, even above that of the nightingale, and the birds crowd to this spot to add their songs to his." The Sultan stepped through the window, but the bird took no notice, continuing his song as before. "My slave," said the princess, "this is the Sultan. Make him a pretty speech." The bird stopped singing at once, and all the other birds stopped too. "The Sultan is welcome," he said. "I wish him long life and all prosperity." "I thank you, good bird," answered the Sultan, seating himself before the repast, which was spread at a table near the window. "I am enchanted to see in you the Sultan and King of the birds." The Sultan, noticing that his favorite dish of cucumber was placed before him, proceeded to help himself to it, and was amazed, too, and that the stuffing was of pearls. "A novelty indeed," cried he, "but I do not understand the reason of it. One cannot eat pearls." "Sire," replied the bird, before either the princes or the princess could speak, Surely your Highness cannot be so surprised at beholding a cucumber stuffed with pearls, when you believed without any difficulty that the Sultana had presented you, instead of children, with a dog, a cat, and a log of wood." "I believed it," answered the Sultan, "because the women attending on her told me so." "The women, sire," said the bird, "were the sisters of the Sultana, who were devoured with jealousy at the honor you had done her, and in order to revenge themselves invented this story. Have them examined, and they will confess their crime. These are your children, who were saved from death by the intendant of your gardens, and brought up by him as if they were his own." Like a flash the truth came to the mind of the Sultan. "Bird," he cried, "my heart tells me that what you say is true. My children," he added, "let me embrace you and embrace each other, not only as brothers and sister, but as having in you the blood royal of Persia, which could flow in no nobler veins." When the first moments of emotion were over, the Sultan hastened to finish his repast, and then turning to his children, he exclaimed, "Today you have made acquaintance with your father. Tomorrow I will bring you the Sultana, your mother. Be ready to receive her." The Sultan then mounted his horse and rode quickly back to the capital. Without an instant's delay he sent for the Grand Vizier and ordered him to seize and question the Sultana's sisters that very day. This was done. They were confronted with each other and proved guilty, and were executed in less than an hour. But the Sultan did not wait to hear that his orders had been carried out before going on foot, followed by his whole court, to the door of the great mosque, and drawing the Sultana with his own hand out of the narrow prison where she had spent so many years, "Madam," he cried, embracing her with tears in his eyes, "I have come to ask your pardon for the injustice I have done you, and to repair it as far as I may. I have already begun by punishing the authors of this abominable crime, and I hope you will forgive me when I introduce you to our children, who are the most charming and accomplished creatures in the whole world. Come with me and take back your position and all the honor that is due to you." This speech was delivered in the presence of a vast multitude of people who had gathered from all parts on the first hint of what was happening, and the news was passed from mouth to mouth in a few seconds. Early next day, the Sultan and Sultana, dressed in robes of state and followed by all the court, set out for the country house of their children. Here the Sultan presented them to the Sultana one by one, and for some time there was nothing but embraces and tears and tender words. Then they ate of the magnificent dinner which had been prepared for them, and after they were all refreshed, they went into the garden, where the Sultan pointed out to his wife the golden water and the singing tree. As to the talking bird, she had already made acquaintance with him. In the evening they rode together back to the capital, the princes on each side of their father, and the princess with her mother. Long before they reached the gates, the way was lined with people, and the air filled with shouts of welcome, with which were mingled the songs of the talking bird sitting in its cage on the lap of the princess, and of the birds who followed it. In this manner they came back to their father's palace. End of Chapter 40. Recording by Dale, Tucson, Arizona. End of the Arabian Nights Entertainments by Andrew Lang.